A city possessed Strasbourg, July 1518. It began with a single pair of feet. Welcome to history for the tired, a quiet place where the past is unraveled, slowly woven gently into soft, strange stories to accompany your thoughts into the night. Tonight, we step into a tale so bizarre, so unsettling, and yet so deeply human, it defies explanation even to this day. This is the story of a town possessed. A story of a woman who danced alone until others joined her, until hundreds were moving in agony, trapped in a rhythmic nightmare. It's a story about the fragility of the mind, the power of belief, and the thin veil separating control from chaos. So settle in, get comfortable, let your breathing slow, and let me take you back to a sweltering summer in the year 1518, to a place where reality began to unravel, and no one could stop dancing. Strasbourg, before the storm, the town of Strasbourg, situated along the river Ill in the heart of the Alsace region, was at once beautiful and burdened. In 1518, it lay under the domain of the Holy Roman Empire, patchwork of city-states, duchies, and bishoprics that sprawled across Central Europe like a great quilt stitched by power and faith. Strasbourg was technically a free imperial city. That meant it wasn't directly controlled by a king or duke, but answered only to the emperor himself. It was an urban island of semi-autonomy, bustling with merchants, bakers, masons, clergy, and street hawkers. The streets were crooked and narrow, lined with half-timbered houses, their upper stories leaning like tired shoulders over market squares. Cobblestones baked under a punishing sun. July had brought with it an oppressive heat wave, one that hung low like a fever over every house, shop, and chapel. Inside the homes, it was worse. Stale air, thick with the smell of sweat, animal dung, and rotting bread. Rats scurried along rafters. Dogs panted miserably in doorways. Chickens fussed in baskets. And everywhere alwise the sound of church bells. Bells for mass, bells for prayer, bells for funerals. Because death was never far. Europe was not long past the Black Death, and outbreaks still flared like sparks across towns and villages. Just a few years before, syphilis had emerged, called the French disease, or the Neapolitan disease, depending on who you asked. People blamed the air, or sin, or the stars. Physicians relied on the theory of humor's black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. It was a time of contradiction. Faith ruled hearts, yet fear ruled minds. Daily life was caught in a tug-of-war between spiritual devotion and physical despair. The people of Strasbourg, though devout, were strained. The harvests had been thin. The grain prices were rising. Taxes were cruel. Bread riots had occurred just years before. Hunger bent backs and soured tempers. People were praying harder, fearing deeper, and waiting for relief, for punishment, or for a sign. And in the second week of July, a woman gave them one. She stepped into the narrow lane just before sunrise. Her name, according to the few records that survive, was Frau Trophia. No first name has survived the centuries, and her history before that moment remains a blank page. Perhaps she had lost a child. Perhaps her husband was cruel. Perhaps she simply broke under the weight of heat, grief, and prayer. Or perhaps she was chosen. She wore the plain linen dress of a working woman. Her hair was tied back. Her face, it is said, was tight with emotion, not joy, not fear, but something stranger. Something pulled from the depths of her bones. And then she began to move. She lifted her arms and swung them as if compelled. Her feet began to tap, then stomp. She twirled in place. She lunged forward. Her movements were not coordinated like a dancer's. They were erratic, harsh, almost violent. There was no music, no flute, no drum, no celebration. Only the soft sound of flesh against stone, and the creak of her shoes as she pivoted, spun, stomped. Neighbors opened their shutters. Peasants paused with their water buckets. No one knew what to make of it. By noon, she was still dancing. By nightfall, she had collapsed from exhaustion. But by dawn, she was dancing again. 3. The watching crowd. For several days, Frau Trophia danced. Her husband, according to legend, begged her to stop. Local priests may have prayed over her. A physician likely visited one of the city's learned men who wore long robes and carried leech jars and dusty tomes. But none could explain her movements. She danced without joy, without purpose, and without end. And slowly, others began to join her. A butcher's son, a young woman who had miscarried just a month before, a baker's apprentice. By the 5th day, there were perhaps a dozen, then 2 dozen. By the end of the 2nd week, nearly 50 people had been taken by the same strange, compulsive motion. They danced in groups, in alleys, in the town square. Some murmured prayers as they moved. Others screamed nonsense or chanted scripture. Their clothes became soaked with sweat. Their feet bled, but still they danced. By the end of July, the number had risen to more than 100%. The town began to panic. For no ordinary affliction, the city council met in haste. Strasbourg's leaders, merchants, lawyers, bishops argued heatedly about what was happening. Was it a disease, a curse, a punishment? One theory came from the physicians. This was an illness of the blood, an excess of heat, a surging of internal fire brought on by the oppressive summer. Their solution was, in hindsight, absurd. Let them dance it out. Let the movement expel the humors. So they built a stage. Yes, a stage. Wooden platforms were set up in public spaces. Musicians were hired to accompany the afflicted. Drummers, flautists. They played fast, frantic tunes, hoping to help the dancers purge themselves of whatever had possessed them. And it worked in the worst possible way. The number of dancers surged. By early August, there were more than 200. Some say 400. One chronicler even claimed 700. They came from every class: peasants, artisans, housewives, even a few priests, rich and poor, young and old. They danced for hours. Some fell unconscious, only to wake and resume. Others broke bones, vomited blood, or collapsed in twitching fits. People died, not metaphorically, literally, from heart attacks, from exhaustion, from heat stroke and wounds left untreated. And still others danced. Strasbourg had become a theater of suffering, and no one knew how to bring down the curtain. The pulse of panic. As the dancers multiplied, so did the onlookers. Merchants sold water to the afflicted. Children imitated the dancers in play, until their parents pulled them away in fear. Priests offered last rites to those who collapsed mid-spin. Some dancers screamed of visions, angels, demons, fire. Others seemed vacant, eyes staring beyond the crowd as their limbs flailed. Rumors blossomed like weeds. Some claimed it was divine punishment for sent too much drinking, too much gambling, too much lust. Others whispered it was the devil's music, a dark melody heard only by the afflicted. Still others believed it was Saint Vincent, old saint, associated with epilepsy and movement disorders. who had cursed them for failing in their devotions. Pilgrims began arriving in town, some hoping to witness a miracle, others seeking healing for their own maladies. The town's mood shifted from panic to awe and then to dread. Was this the end of days? Had God chosen Strasbourg for some message, or was something older and darker at work? Saints, sins, and spirits in Strasbourg. Saints were not just prayed to, they were feared. Chief among them was Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr whose legend had grown monstrous over the centuries. In the lore of the region, Saint Vitus could both cure and curse. It was said that those who displeased him through sin, negligence, or mockery would be seized by fits of wild dancing and twitching. They would lose control of their limbs, their voices, even their minds. So when townspeople began collapsing from endless movement, many pointed to Vitus. Was this a mass possession? Were these people being punished for their pride, or for the city's growing worldliness and trade? Could it be a test of faith? The church had answers, unsatisfying ones, but answers nonetheless. The Bishop of Strasbourg ordered processions and prayers. Choirs sang penitential psalms through the streets. Altars were draped in black. The cathedral bells rang long and low, tolling not for the dead, but for the possessed. Still, the dancers came. One Manon, older weaver, claimed he had heard a voice in his dreams telling him to dance until he burned clean. Another woman insisted she saw the Virgin Mary herself urging her to move. A teenage boy swore his legs were no longer his own, that they belonged to the air, whatever that meant. They were not faking. Witnesses, dozens of them, reported that these people truly could not stop. Their eyes were wide but not aware. Their movements, at times violent, at others so fluid they seemed choreographed. But they weren't coordinated. This was not theater. It was something far stranger. Medicine and mayhem. The town's physicians, trained in the humoral theory of medicine, clung desperately to logic. In their view, the body contained IV fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness arose when one of these humors became unbalanced. Too much heat. Your blood was overactive. Too much cold, perhaps phlegm. Too much dancing. That could be a manifestation of internal fire brought on by summer heat, spicy foods, or emotional distress. So what did they prescribe? They told the council to keep the dancers moving. More music, bigger spaces. Let it all burn out. What followed was chaos. The city square turned into a kind of morbid dance hall. Musicians played frantically, unsure whether they were helping or harming. Food vendors capitalized on the crowd. Beggars knelt in prayer or threw coins at the dancers, hoping to gain favor from whatever spirit had come to town. By now, the dancers' feet were cracked and bleeding. Some wore through the soles of their shoes. Others bound their feet with cloth or tried to wrap them in leaves. Their clothing became soaked with sweat. Their eyes often rolled back in their heads. Some wailed songs that made no sense. Others barked like dogs or recited Latin phrases they'd never been taught. People who joined the crowd to watch often left shaken. Something about the dancers was contagious. Not just their movements, but the fear they inspired. Mothers kept children indoors. Inns stopped serving strangers. The entire city began to pulse with nervous energy. No one could predict who would be next. 8. The contagion of the mind. Modern scholars, centuries later, would argue that what struck Strasbourg wasn't a disease at all, it was a form of mass psychogenic illness. what we'd now call mass hysteria. That is, a psychological event made physical. An outbreak not of germs or viruses, but of fear and belief. And indeed, all the ingredients were there. A population strained by famine, religious anxiety, and social tension. A culture steeped in saintly punishment and spiritual warfare. A moment of high heat, low trust, and overwhelming fatigue. In such conditions, belief becomes powerful enough to override reason. One woman dances, others see her. Their minds already unsteady latch onto it. They begin to move, not because they choose to, but because they feel they must. What begins as symbolism becomes somatic, real. The body obeys the mind, even to the point of death. Some might scoff at this today, but have we not seen crowds behave irrationally in our own time? Panics, hysterias, trends that spread faster than explanation can follow. Human minds are social machines. We mirror, we mimic, and when frightened, we do so with even greater intensity. But in 1518, they had no word for this, no framework, only saints and sins, only spirits and sweat. And still, the dancers kept dancing. Ix, the dead and the disappearing in August. The first wave of deaths began. The town's record books don't give us exact numbers. Some say a dozen died. Others suggest hundreds. Some collapsed mid-dance, their hearts bursting. Others were carried away, moaning, only to die in bed, with their legs still twitching. A few simply disappeared. One story tells of a nun who joined the dancers, then vanished into the forest and was never seen again. Another of a blacksmith who danced until both kneecaps shattered. He lived another year, crippled, bitter, convinced he had been cursed by a rival guild. Families grieved, then feared, because grief was familiar, but this was something else. Mothers began tying ropes around their children's ankles at night. Priests urged daily confession. Barbers, who also served as surgeons, bled patients, trying to draw out the heat. One man paid to have frogs placed on his chest, believing they would absorb the fever. Nothing worked. By the end of August, Strasbourg was broken. The town square was stained with blood. Musicians had stopped playing. Many had fled. The stages had been torn down. Still, the dancers moved. And then, finally, the council changed course. The pilgrimage to the mountain, in a desperate reversal. The city leaders banned public dancing. Music was outlawed. Instruments were confiscated. Gatherings were broken up. But the damage had been done, so they turned to faith. The remaining dancers, those still moving, or too weak to stand, were gathered and placed in wagons. They were driven north to the foothills of the Vosges Mountains, where a shrine to Saint Vitus stood. There, monks welcomed them, not with music, but with prayer. They were given crosses, red shoes, holy water. Their names were added to books. Some were prayed over for days. Others were made to sleep with relics, bones of saints, strands of hair, fragments of old robes. Slowly, some began to quiet. Their legs stopped moving. Their eyes cleared. They slept, sometimes for days. And when they returned to Strasbourg, they never danced again. A city in mourning. By the autumn of 1518, the heat had passed. So had the plague. That's what it was. No new dancers appeared. The afflicted recovered or died, and life, somehow, resumed. But the city had changed. People whispered more carefully in church. Mothers lit extra candles. Street performers were watched with suspicion. The square where the dancing had reached its peak remained empty for weeks. No weddings were held there, no feasts. The air had not cleared, had been marked. Chroniclers recorded the event in careful detail. The Strasbourg dancing plague entered the annals of strange European lore. But even then, just months after, it was clear that no one truly understood what had happened. It wasn't just movement. It wasn't just madness. It was something older, something deeper, a kind of collective rupture. 12. The first footsteps echo on. So ends the first part of our tale. But the story of Strasbourg doesn't end here. Because the dancing plague did not come from nowhere. It would not be the last of its kind. What happened in that city in the summer of 1518 still baffles historians, psychologists, and spiritual thinkers alike. Was it a protest in disguise, a release of trauma, a warning, or merely a mirror showing us what happens when too many burdens pile up on too many souls? In our next section, we'll follow the fever as it spread through the region and examine how the authorities made the crisis worse. We'll look at how dancers were seen not just as victims, but as threats. And we'll explore the strange mix of pagan folklore, Christian mysticism, and medieval medicine that shaped the response. But for now, rest. You've heard enough footsteps for one night. Let the rhythm fade. Let your mind go quiet. And if this tale has held your curiosity, don't forget to follow History for the Tired, where the strangest stories from the past are told gently, slowly, and always with care. Until next time, listen for the hush. The fever spreads how fear, faith, and folklore made the strange epidemic worse. There is no enemy more dangerous than one that lives in the Minden scene, unmeasurable and contagious. Welcome back to History for the Tired, the channel that gently untangles the past, while letting your mind drift into deeper thought or rest. In the first section of our story, we traveled to Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, where dozens and then hundreds of townspeople began to dance uncontrollably. They danced for days, sometimes for weeks. Some collapsed, some died, and no one could explain why. Now we cast a wider net, because the truth is, Strasbourg wasn't an isolated case. What happened there was merely the most famous sand, perhaps the best documented, of a wider, more mysterious phenomenon that haunted Europe for centuries. Tonight, we trace the invisible ripples. We look at how the strange affliction moved through other regions, how it was interpreted by doctors, clergy, and common folk, and we reflect on how ideas, when powerful enough, can make bodies obey. So settle into your pillow, your chair, your quiet evening. Let the candle of curiosity glow low and steady, and follow me, step by step, as we walk back into the fog of the forgotten. Dancers in the dark. Before Strasbourg, long before Frau Trophia's fateful steps, the land already trembled with stories. In the summer of 1374, more than a century before Strasbourg's outbreak, something strange happened in the city of Aachen, Germany. Chroniclers tell us that crowds of people began to pour into the streets, twisting and leaping in apparent agony. They convulsed, howled, and claimed to see visions, some of the heavens opening, others of hideous demons clawing at their backs. This was no mere party. There was fear and pain, and a sense of something beyond explanation. Witnesses described dancers falling into trances, foaming at the mouth, or gasping about punishment from saints. Some sang hymns, others wailed like animals. Some couldn't remember their own names. And then the plague spread. Within weeks, towns and villages along the Rhine were experiencing similar events. In Cologne, Metz, Trier, Strasbourg, Liege, and as far south as Italy. Sometimes hundreds danced, sometimes only a few. But the effect was always the same: strange movements, loss of control, and fear that something had taken hold. These dancers weren't simply acting out, they were, in many cases, suffering. Some wore themselves down until their feet bled. Others collapsed and died of exhaustion. Children joined the afflicted. Entire families sometimes moved as if bewitched. And always there was the whisper of Saint Vitus. Who was Saint Vitus, really? To understand how this plague spread, not just physically, but culturally, we must understand the figure at the heart of it. Saint Vitus, or San Vito in Italian, Sankt Vita in German. Vitus was a Christian martyr, likely from Sicily, who died in the early 4th century during the persecutions of Emperor Diocletian. The stories say he was a child only 7 or 12, depending on the version, when he was arrested for refusing to renounce his Christian faith. He was tortured, thrown to wild beasts, and finally beheaded. But like many saints of the early church, his story didn't end with death. It began to evolve. By the 10th century, Saint Vitus had become one of the 14 holy helper saints, invoked especially during times of disease or misfortune. But unlike saints of healing or peace, Vitus's influence came with a dark side. In particular, he became associated with convulsions, nervous disorders, epilepsy, and uncontrollable movement. People believed that if you angered Saint Vitus or failed to honor him properly, he would curse you with madness. The dance would be your punishment. And so, in times of stress or fear, especially during harvests or plagues, villagers would perform ritual dances to honor Vitus. They would gather in processions. They would sing. They would dance in circles, hands joined. Some did so joyfully, others out of dread. Over time, the boundary between ritual and reality blurred. When dancers began to move uncontrollably in real life, when they cried and wailed and collapsed, it made sense, at least, to a medieval audience. This was Saint Vitus's curse made visible. The stories had become flesh, and belief, as we'll soon see, is a powerful contagion. When faith and fear intertwine, the medieval world was not built on science and certainty, it was built on faith, folklore, and fear. To modern minds, it's easy to look back and wonder how anyone could believe that a saint's wrath caused a person to dance to their death. But to the people of the 14th and 15th centuries, the world was alive with invisible forces. Storms were sent by God. Illness was punishment for sin. Madness came from demons, or witches, or the anger of saints. And when a man or woman fell to the ground in convulsions, twisting and screaming, the explanation didn't need to wait for blood tests or brain scans. The answer was already written in sermons, stained glass, and holy relics. So it was that during outbreaks of the dance, pilgrimages were organized. Villagers would gather the afflicted and walk or carry them to chapels dedicated to Saint Vitus in places like Zug, Switzerland, and Prum, Germany. These shrines became gathering points for the desperate. People believed that touching the relics of Vitus bone fragments, a drop of blood, or even cloth from a robe could cure the madness. Many of the afflicted wore amulets bearing his name, or bits of iron, or strings of garlic, hoping to break the curse. In some places, the very act of dancing at the shrine was part of the cure. The afflicted would be placed in the chapel and allowed to dance freely until they collapsed, their demons exorcised through exhaustion. But of course, that only reinforced the pattern. A person danced They were brought to the shrine. They danced again. They collapsed. They recovered, didn't. But the ritual spread, and with it, the belief that dancing was the symptom of something sacred, dangerous, and contagious. Doctors and the science of misunderstanding. As the centuries passed and outbreaks recurred, more educated observers began to take notice. But medieval medicine, for all its learning, was still based largely on the humoral theory, the idea that health depended on balancing for bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much black bile, you might become melancholic. Too much blood, you could become overheated. So when people began dancing uncontrollably, physicians in places like Strasbourg developed theories. One popular diagnosis was hot blood. It was thought that the summer sun had overheated people's bodies, especially the blood, and the only way to cool it was to dance the fever out. Others believed it was a form of melancholia turned outward. Some even compared it to rabies, or mad dog disease, something that infected the nerves and drove people to madness. One physician, named Paracelsus, writing in the early 16th century, dismissed the idea that the dancers were possessed. He saw the mania as an illness of the imagination, an ailment that spread through suggestion and psychological weakness. But even he, one of the more forward-thinking minds of his time, didn't fully grasp what was happening. Today, we'd call this kind of outbreak a psychogenic illness, a form of mass hysteria or conversion disorder. But that diagnosis didn't exist in 1518, and without it, even the most well-intentioned remedies often made things worse. Case in point, during the Strasbourg outbreak, local authorities decided to cure the dancers by building a stage and hiring musicians. They believed that if the dancers were given room and rhythm, the illness would burn itself out. It didn't. In fact, it seemed to attract more people, because the more the event was seen, the more real it became. The more real it became, the more people were drawn in, whether through fear, suggestion, or some deeper psychological trigger. The epidemic fed on itself, and music meant to be a cure became its accomplice. When the body becomes the battlefield, let's pause for a moment, not in facts, but in feeling. Imagine yourself in the year 1518. You live in a crowded house. The harvest has failed. Your child is coughing. The bishop preaches doom. The rats scurry in corners. The bread is stale. The sky feels too heavy. And then someone in your village begins to dance. At first, you think it's a joke. Then you hear them cry out. Their face is contorted. They weep as they spin, like they're trying to shake something off, but it clings to them. You watch them sweat, bleed, and fall. The next day, 2 more begin. The day after, 5. You begin to feel dizzy, though you've had nothing to drink. Your hands tremble. You wake from dreams in which you're dancing. You feel heat behind your eyes. Your breath quickens for no reason, and then you take a step. 1 step becomes 2. You tell yourself you're only stretching your legs, but deep down, something has shifted. You're not in full control anymore. This is how mass psychogenic illness works. Not as a lie, not as make-believe, but as a powerful expression of stress, fear, and emotion that the body cannot contain. When there are no words for your suffering, the body speaks. And in Strasbourg, as elsewhere, it spoke through the feet. Clergy, curses, and confessionals in medieval Strasbourg, no crisis was ever purely physical. Illness, famine, and natural disasters were seen not only as problems of the flesh, but of the soul. And in a world where the church was the spine of society, no answer was complete without divine consideration. As the dancing continued day after day, week after week, local priests were summoned to assess the spiritual condition of the city. They visited the afflicted. They consulted relics. They prayed over the streets. Some believed the dancers were possessed not by one demon, but by a collective spirit of madness that had entered Strasbourg like a fog. They whispered names of ancient devils, invoked the wrath of God, and warned that Strasbourg was being punished for its sins. Others, more merciful, believed the dancers were afflicted by a saint's sorrow, especially that of Saint Vitus, who was said to grieve the moral decline of the people. These clergy urged confession, fasting, and penance. One bishop wrote that the dance has entered the blood like a fever of guilt. It shall leave only when the soul is made light again. In response, mass confessions were organized. Priests set up portable confessionals in the streets. Whole families knelt to beg forgiveness. Bells were rung. Incense was burned. Choirs sang hymns in the hope of calming the plague. And still the dancers danced. When the city lost its breath by the third week, the crisis in Strasbourg had reached its peak. Eyewitness accounts, though colored by time, describe a scene that feels almost theatrical in its horror. Several dozen people were dancing at any given time. Some had been moving for days, collapsing only to rise again. Their clothes were soaked with sweat and blood. Feet were wrapped in rags or torn bare. Faces were vacant, drawn into grimaces or gasps. Some wept openly while moving. Others laughed hysterically or chanted fragments of psalms. Children tried to imitate the dancers before being pulled away by terrified parents. Food vendors avoided the area. Horses balked when approaching the sound. Drummers, hired to accompany the movement, began to question their role. The stage built to contain the dancers had become a grotesque theater. And then, finally, the city began to respond with containment. 8th, the mountain shrine by late July. City leaders, perhaps under pressure from clergy and desperate physicians, decided that the only way to end the plague was to remove the dancers entirely. So they rounded up the most afflicted, placed them on wagons, and carted them away. Their destination, a shrine to Saint Vitus, located in the mountains near the town of Sarvern. There, the afflicted were led barefoot around the church. Priests tied small crosses and bits of holy cloth to their arms and necks. They were sprinkled with holy water. Hymns were sung. Then they were allowed, perhaps even encouraged to, dance again, but this time under watchful eyes. This time, as part of a controlled ritual, some recovered, some didn't. But over the following weeks, the number of new dancers in Strasbourg began to decline. The spell, it seemed, had lifted. Why? Perhaps it was the break in the cycle, the removal of public spectacle, the calming effect of ritual. Perhaps it was simple fatigue, or perhaps the epidemic had simply run its course, burning out like a fever. Whatever the cause, the city began to breathe again, and yet the questions remained. Was it ever real? Historians have long debated what really happened in Strasbourg and in the other dancing outbreaks of the Middle Ages. Some believe it was purely psychological, a case of mass hysteria, fueled by fear, poverty, and religious dread. Others propose ergot, poisoning, a hallucinogenic fungus that grows on damp rye and can cause seizures, delirium, and muscle spasms. Ergot contains chemicals similar to LSD and can trigger bizarre behavior. But ergot alone may not explain the social pattern the fact that it was usually groups of people, often in urban settings, and that the behavior followed certain rhythms. Still others suggest autoimmune or viral conditions, or even neurological disorders like Huntington's disease, though these are rare and DANCED in such group settings. What's more likely, most agree, is that the idea of the dance was more powerful than any physical illness. People truly experienced the symptoms, but not because of poison or demons, because they believed, because the mind, especially in times of stress and suffering, seeks an outlet. And when stories are strong enough, they become real. The silence that followed after the last dancers were taken to the shrine and the final music faded from the Strasbourg streets. The silence that settled was heavy. For weeks, the town had echoed with the sound of shuffling feet, rhythmic drums, cries of pain, and the chaotic murmur of crowds. Now there was only the creaking of carts, the ringing of bells, and the slow return of daily life. But things were not as they were. Some dancers returned home with broken bodies, bruised feet, strained muscles, and lingering tremors. Others never came back at all, their fates lost in church records or family silence. Neighbors who had witnessed the mania carried a strange kind of guilt, like survivors of a storm that only touched certain houses. Many spoke of the events in whispers, afraid of summoning something back. Churches continued to pray against future outbreaks. Doctors wrote their theories. Chronicles were inked, often blending fact with moral interpretation. And slowly, the dancing plague of 1518 entered the realm of legend, strange tale told to children, a warning to be faithful, a lesson about the body's fragility. But even as the event faded from the present, its mark on history had been made. The legacy of the dancing plague, though it's rarely taught in school textbooks, the dancing plague remains one of the most fascinating unsolved phenomena in recorded history. Not because of the dancing alone, but because it sits at the intersection of so many human fears and hopes. It's a story of desperation and faith, of how communities react to trauma, and of how belief, whether in a curse, a saint, or a disease, can shape what we experience in our own bodies. In modern times, similar events have occurred. In Tanzania, in the 1960s, a laughing epidemic affected hundreds of students in boarding schools, spreading from person to person without any clear biological cause. In South Korea, a wave of fainting swept through a group of factory workers. Tests found nothing, yet the symptoms were real. In post-war Germany, entire schools would be affected by spontaneous fits of crying, shaking, or sudden illness. What these episodes share is not fakery, but a deep, often unspoken suffering translated through the body when words fail. The dancing plague, then, is not just a medieval curiosity. It's a mirror, one that shows us how vulnerable the human mind can be under pressure and how resilient it is in the face of the inexplicable. The mystery lingers despite centuries of study. No single explanation fully accounts for what happened in Strasbourg in 1518. Ergot poisoning. A possibility, but it doesn't explain the group behavior or the repetitive pattern of outbreaks over the centuries. Mass psychogenic illness, likely, but why dancing, and why with such intensity and duration? Some folklorists propose that the events were influenced by pagan memoria, remnant of old fertility rites, or trance dances, long suppressed by the church, but still lingering in the cultural subconscious. Others speculate that it was a combination: physical strain, religious fear, social stress, and deep psychological repression, all meeting at once. a perfect storm. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the dancing plague is that, like many of history's mysteries, it defies clean answers. It asks us to sit with discomfort, to accept that sometimes, even in our age of science and clarity, there are corners of the human story that remain in shadow, and that in those shadows we can still hear the echo of footsteps, closing thoughts, dancing with the past. The dancing plague of 1518 is not just a bizarre episode from history, it's a parable, one with many layers. It reminds us of the power of belief, not just religious, but psychological. It shows how communal suffering can manifest in strange ways. It reminds us that the line between the mind and body is not as clear as we might think. In Strasbourg, they danced out of fear, or grief, or ecstasy, or confusion, perhaps all at once. And today, we still do the same. We don't always call it dancing. Sometimes it's scrolling endlessly through our phones, or nervously laughing, or overworking, or buying things we don't need, or staring at ceilings late at night. Our own forms of movement in response to anxiety and helplessness. The context changes, but the human heart remains the same. And so the dancing plague of 1518 lives on, not just in the pages of medical journals or dusty chronicles, but in each moment we feel overwhelmed, caught in rhythms we didn't choose, trying to find our way back to stillness. The dance that defied explanation. Imagine standing in the heart of Strasbourg, a medieval city alive with the sounds of trade, prayer, and the clang of distant church bells. But something is wrong. Instead of normal bustle, the town square is overtaken by a strange, rhythmic phenomenon. Dozens of people, pale and exhausted, move with wild, erratic energy, dancing day and night, with no music, no joy, and no explanation. No one could stop them. They danced until they collapsed. Some died. Many couldn't remember why they started. Over 500 years later, we still don't know exactly what happened. Welcome to Section 3, Unraveling the Mystery, where we dive into the eerie, perplexing, and at times almost unbelievable theories behind the dancing plague of 1518. In this part, we'll explore both the historical context and the early attempts to explain the outbreak. Because, as with so many great mysteries, understanding the questions is just as important as chasing the answers. So close your eyes, take a breath, and come with me into the tangle of fact, folklore, and fear that has baffled generations. The chroniclers speak. First clues, the primary sources from 1518, are chilling in their simplicity. Chroniclers describe men and women dancing madly in the streets, unable to stop themselves. Some accounts speak of suffering grievously, of people leaping and twisting with such intensity that they eventually fell unconscious. These aren't metaphorical tales or symbolic parables. They appear in civic records, city council notes, letters between bishops and doctors. There are even medical prescriptions from the time, many urging that music be played to help dancers complete the trance so it would end. One local physician wrote, "This affliction is not from the flesh, but from the humors of the mind, strange vapors that rise like smoke in the skull." Others were less scientific. They spoke of divine punishment, demonic possession, or cursed air lingering over the city like invisible ink. But what makes the dancing plague so fascinating is that no single cause was ever confirmed, and even among witnesses there was disagreement about what they were seeing. Some said it was spiritual, some said it was contagious, some said it was theaterin, expression of a deeper unrest. Which brings us to the theories. Theory 1. Ergot poisoning, the fungi of madness. One of the most enduring theories is that of ergotism, also known as St. Anthony's fire. It's a poisoning that occurs when people eat bread made from rye infected with a fungus called Claviceps purpurea. Ergot contains alkaloids similar to LSD and can cause hallucinations, spasms, delirium, and convulsions. People afflicted often experienced burning sensations in their limbs, vivid hallucinations, and erratic movement. In this view, the dancers weren't cursed, they were high. Ingesting ergot-tainted grain could theoretically trigger a mass reaction, especially in communities where everyone shared the same contaminated food. There are some strengths to this theory. Strasbourg had recently experienced famine, meaning people may have eaten spoiled or poorly stored grain. The symptoms of ergotism, triching, and mental confusions somewhat resemble what witnesses described. Other outbreaks of strange behavior in medieval Europe were possibly linked to ergot, but the theory also has weaknesses. Ergot poisoning usually affects people individually, not in coordinated outbreaks. The symptoms are painful burning limbs, blackened skin, not conducive to prolonged movement. The behavior in Strasbourg lasted weeks, suggesting a more psychological than chemical cause. Still, ergot remains one of the most cited explanations. It's compelling, terrifying, and it hints at a grim irony that the bread people turned to for survival may have helped trigger their suffering. Theory 2. Mass psychogenic illness, a city in crisis. Another widely accepted theory is mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria. This is when a group of people, usually under extreme stress, begin to exhibit physical symptoms without a clear biological cause. It's not fake, it's not acting. These symptoms are real to those experiencing them, but they stem from the psyche, not a virus or bacteria. In this theory, the people of Strasbourg danced because their minds compelled them to. They were not physically ill but mentally overwhelmed, and there was good reason to be. In the years leading up to the 1518 outbreak, Strasbourg had suffered famine, economic collapse, rising tensions with religious reformers, plague outbreaks, extreme weather events tied to the Little Ice Age. It was a time of collective trauma. According to historians, MPI often emerges in tightly bound communities, especially when people are under pressure and lack medical understanding. The dancing might have started with one person, perhaps Frau Trophia, as recorded, who was overwhelmed by stress or loss and began moving as a form of emotional release. Her behavior might have triggered a psychological chain reaction. Neighbors, witnessing her dance, were already primed by fear and superstition. When they saw her moving, something in their subconscious gave way. Others joined, not because they chose to but because something inside said they must. Soon, the dance became a communal script. People began to act it out without knowing why, because it gave shape to their pain. The power of belief. To understand how mass psychogenic illness could spread so dramatically, we need to consider the power of belief in 16th century Europe. People believed in saints who could cure or curse. They believed in spiritual battles waged in the invisible world. They believed their actions could draw divine favor or provoke punishment. These beliefs weren't abstract, they were woven into the fabric of daily life. In this context, it's easy to see how witnessing strange behavior might not lead to skepticism, but to deep fear, the sense that one must join in or be next. Moreover, Religious art of the time often depicted saints like Saint Vitus or Saint John dancing as part of ecstatic devotion or torment. To a person in distress, caught between hunger and hope, such imagery might not be symbolic. It might feel like an invitation. Could the dancers of 1518 have been acting out a vision of suffering they de-absorbed since childhood? Could they have believed that dancing beyond their control was the only way to atone or to survive? Mind over matter, psychological possession, or spiritual despair? Let's look deeper into the human mind, not as it is understood by modern science, but as it was imagined by 16th century Europe. In Strasbourg in 1518, there was no division between mental illness and spiritual vulnerability. What we call psychosomatic today was often interpreted then as spiritual attack. This means that people dancing in the streets may not have believed themselves to be sick in the body or the brain, but possessed by forces beyond their control. Such beliefs had power, tremendous power, and belief, as many modern studies have shown, is one of the most powerful agents of human behavior. If a person believes they are cursed, their body can begin to behave as if it is. If a community believes a saint demands movement, people will move. In the decades and centuries before 1518, people claimed that entire groups had become possessed, cursed, or overwhelmed by a dancing compulsion. Some blamed it on Saint John, others on Saint Vitus, whose feast day was often linked to ecstatic dances in his honor. One such report from Aachen in 1374 tells of people leaping, screaming, and foaming at the mouth, as if gripped by spiritual energy. These weren't isolated events. They form a haunting pattern. Could Strasbourg's plague be part of a long history of ritualistic mass dance gone awry? Or were these spiritual beliefs a cultural mask for deeply psychological reactions to famine, trauma, and helplessness? The answer may lie somewhere in the convergence of both. Cultures have found solace, release, and expression in ritual movement. From the trance dances of Sufi mystics to the whirling practices of shamanic ceremonies, rhythm and bodily expression have often been used to channel emotion and spiritual energy. In pre-Christian Europe, long before the rise of Strasbourg as a medieval hub, certain regions practiced seasonal dance rituals, often linked to fertility, the harvest, or the appeasement of spirits. When Christianity took hold, many of these dances were banned or absorbed into new liturgical contexts. But cultural memory is stubborn. It lingers, sometimes subconsciously, for generations. Could the dancing plague of 1518 be the unconscious resurfacing of ancient rituals triggered by collective stress? She's seen the images of saints dancing in ecstasy. She's heard tales of pagan ancestors moving to drive away pestilence or win back favor from the gods. Something awakens, something old. Soon, the crowd joins not as an act of rebellion or mockery, but as a kind of collective remembering, distorted by centuries and desperation. They're not reenacting a ritual. They're being carried by one. This theory doesn't need magic or poison. It needs only memory, culture, and the perfect storm of stress and symbolic familiarity. The music that wasn't there. Strangely, many chroniclers note that the dancers moved without music, or that music was added only later by city authorities trying to soothe the crowd. This opens another strange door. Dancing, by nature, is rhythmic. We move to a beat. But what happens when the beat is internal, not from drums, but from the body itself? Modern neurologists have documented rare conditions where patients experience auditory hallucinations, often rhythmic, which can result in involuntary movement. In certain types of temporal lobe epilepsy, individuals may experience brief episodes of compulsive motions, sometimes walking in circles, rocking, or gesturing rhythmically triggered by the brain's misfiring circuits. Could a similar neural episode, perhaps spread through emotional suggestion or mimicry, explain the unending movements? It's speculative, yes, but so is every theory in this strange puzzle. And the fact that these episodes were not accompanied by music, that the rhythm was imposed by some internal or cultural metronome, deepens the sense of mystery. Theory 4. Neurological storms in a failing society. Let's go further into modern medicine. Some neuroscientists suggest that stress, trauma, and extreme environmental pressures can trigger group behaviors that border on seizure-like. The 16th century lacked our understanding of neurology, but their bodies functioned the same as ours. Extreme malnutrition, dehydration. Combine this with fever, infectious disease, and overexertion, and the line between reality and hallucination blurs. A city overwhelmed by stress might become, in effect, a neurological amplifier, where a few cases of genuine psychological or neurological distress are mirrored, mimicked, and magnified by others. When everyone is on edge and the air feels cursed, it doesn't take much to push a community over. Even today, episodes of contagious behavior, from schoolyard fainting spells to mass vomiting incidents, are recorded around the world, often with no clear biological cause. We call it conversion disorder or mass psychogenic response, but at its heart, it reflects something both ancient and modern. The mind and body are deeply linked, and the nervous system is vulnerable to the social environment. In this light, the dancing plague may have been the medieval equivalent of a citywide panic attack, expressed through movement rather than silence. X, between heaven and hell. And finally, let's return to the heart of the matter. Why dancing? Why not screaming, or crying, or violence? Why this eerily rhythmic, strangely expressive motion that led people to their deaths? Perhaps because dancing, unlike most expressions, sits at a crossroads. It is both joy and madness, both prayer and protest. It can be sacred or profane, a release or a punishment. To dance uncontrollably is to surrender. To move without rest to the point of collapse is to mimic the passions of the saints, the frenzies of the possessed, and the rituals of the ancients all at once. Strasbourg in 1518 may have found itself standing between heaven and hell, with no clear path to either. And so the people danced, searching for escape, meaning, or perhaps simply an end. Patterns in time. Dancing fevers before and after Strasbourg. To understand the strangeness of Strasbourg's 1518 plague, we must look both backward and forward in time, because, curiously, the dancing plague was not an isolated event. It was part of a pattern, chilling recurrence of similar outbreaks across centuries and continents. Let's travel to Aachen, Germany, in 1374, where the earliest recorded dancing mania swept across the Rhineland. Accounts tell of hundreds of people dancing in the streets, screaming, convulsing, and collapsing. The local bishop called it a sickness of the soul. In Italy, reports from the 14th and 15th centuries speak of the tarantism phenomenon, where victims allegedly bitten by a spider, the tarantula would, dance wildly to expel the venom. Physicians and priests gathered musicians to play fast music, encouraging the afflicted to dance until they collapsed. Whether caused by spider bites or not, the dancers claimed relief only came through movement. Even as late as the 18th century, travelers in Madagascar and parts of East Africa reported outbreaks of dancing sickness, especially among women, that would spread through villages. French colonial officials described it as a type of collective trance. What do these events share? Dance as an involuntary act, strong association with spiritual or cultural beliefs, contagion-like spread across communities, higher prevalence among marginalized or stressed populations. It suggests that Strasbourg, 1518, was not an accident, but a node in a larger, older phenomenon, where the human body becomes the stage for shared distress. Mirror of madness. Other forms of collective behavior. Dancing is only one expression of what scientists call collective behavior. Disorders, an umbrella term for group reactions that defy traditional medical diagnosis. Here are just a few modern parallels. 1. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic in a boarding school in Tanzania. A single fit of laughter among students spiraled into a months-long epidemic. Over 1,000 people were affected. Entire villages were shut down. Victims reported dizziness, crying, respiratory issues, all sparked by laughter. 2. The June bug outbreak. Dozens of textile workers in a U.S. factory reported nausea, dizziness, and rashes. The suspected cause was a bug bite, but no bugs were ever found. The CDC concluded it was a case of mass psychogenic illness. 3. The twitching girls of Leroy, New York. In a high school in upstate New York, teenage girls began to experience involuntary tics and vocal outbursts. Doctors ruled out toxins and infections. Eventually, the symptoms faded as media attention died down. The suspected cause, psychological contagion, exacerbated by social media. These examples reinforce a disturbing truth. The line between mind and body is thinner than we like to believe. And in the right conditions, a community, be it medieval or modern, can fall into patterns of behavior that spread like wildfire. Strasbourg's dancers may not have been cursed, poisoned, or insane. They may simply have been human. Dance of Death, a cultural memory of the plague. Now let us explore a haunting possibility. What if the dancing plague wasn't an outbreak of madness, but a ritual of grief? The early 1500s were a time of collective mourning. Europe was emerging from centuries of plague. Families were still burying generations lost to the Black Death. In art, the danse macabre, or dance of death, became a central motif. Skulls led parades of peasants and popes alike. The message was clear: death comes for us all. These images weren't just symbolic, they were emotional echoes, an attempt to make sense of senseless loss. Could the dancers of Strasbourg have been unconsciously performing a funeral rite for society itself? Their movements, desperate and endless, echo the skeleton dances painted in churches. They twist and leap like the figures carved into plague memorials. They perform a mourning too large for words, too deep for prayer. In this light, the plague becomes not a sickness, but a living lament, and their collapse becomes the only possible conclusion to a grief that could no longer be contained. 14. Myth in the making. The role of memory and story. As with all great mysteries, the dancing plague of 1518 has grown in legend. Over time, the story has taken on a life of its own. Some versions claim hundreds died, others say thousands danced. Some tell of children leaping into rivers, others of musicians going mad from playing endlessly for the possessed. Historians now believe that the death toll was likely lower than legends suggest, and that the number of active dancers peaked in the dozens, not hundreds. But the essence of the story remains. A group of people overtaken by movement for reasons no one could fully explain, and perhaps that is why it continues to resonate. It is a myth in the truest sense, not because it is false, but because it expresses a truth too complex for simple facts. We see ourselves in those dancers, our anxiety, our helplessness, our desire to be free, even if it means surrendering control, and our longing to make meaning of it all. When the music finally stopped by early September of 1518, the dancing plague was beginning to fade. City records show that the afflicted were moved, some willingly, some not, to a mountain shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus near Strasbourg. There, priests conducted exorcisms, rituals, and even prescribed pilgrimage dances intended to help purge the affliction in a sacred space. In a way, the city leaders had given in to the narrative. If the dancers were cursed, then perhaps only the saint who cursed them could grant mercy. According to reports, many of the dancers recovered after this journey. Perhaps it was the change of environment. Perhaps it was the structure of the ritual. Perhaps the sense of care from the community finally was enough to break the cycle. No definitive number of deaths was ever recorded, but some chronicles mention individuals collapsing from exhaustion, dehydration, and heart failure. The city returned to its troubled routines. The harvest came, the years moved forward, but the memory remained. A strange time, people said, a cursed summer. And even today, over 500 years later, the why still haunts us. Lessons in madness and meaning. The dancing plague is often cited in psychology textbooks, medical journals, and history classes as a prime example of mass hysteria. Often carries a tone of dismissal, as if the suffering was imagined or less real. It wasn't. Whether through trauma, cultural pressure, spiritual longing, or psychological fracture, the people of Strasbourg danced themselves into the pages of history. They were real. Their suffering was real. Their movements, however strange, were a message. Perhaps one we're still struggling to translate. When modern scholars attempt to explain the event, they offer theories: ergotism, social mimicry, conversion disorder, political stress. Each is plausible. None are complete. The truth of Strasbourg may be that no single answer is sufficient, because the dancing plague didn't emerge from a single source. It was born from a storm of causes, layered like sediment. A culture steeped in spiritual symbolism, a community ravaged by famine and war, a people without power, finding motion where words failed. It is this complexity that makes the dancing plague so enduring. It reminds us that history is not just dates and events. It is emotion, belief, body, and breath. Echoes in the modern world. You might think, we're different now. We understand the brain. We trust science. We don't dance ourselves to death. But if you look closer, the echoes remain. Think of viral challenges that spread across TikTok and YouTube. Some lighthearted, some dangerous. People mimic each other. A dance, a stunt, a reaction. It spreads. Now imagine that amplified by terror, or grief, or loneliness. What would stop it? We also see how stress manifests physically. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many people developed tics, muscle spasms, and panic attacks. Some doctors reported spikes in functional movement disorders, especially among teens. We are still susceptible to contagious behavior, not only ideas, but sensations. The dancing plague was not a relic of a less enlightened time. It was Zond Isa mirror, dancing on the edge. Why it haunts us, the true terror of the dancing plague, lies in what it reveals, that under the right pressure, the human body may betray its own will, that the boundary between sanity and madness is thin, that society can push people into expressions that feel alien even to themselves. But there is also something poetic, perhaps even redemptive about it. Dancing, at its core, is a release, a surrender, a letting go. Even when the body moves against the mind's desire, it moves toward something. And in Strasbourg, for a brief and terrible summer, it moved toward release of fear, of grief, of everything the people could not name. Perhaps, in some way, the dancing was a ritual. The world needed an accidental ceremony, marking the end of one age and the threshold of another. And so it lingers in our memory, not just because it was strange, but because it speaks to a part of us we rarely face, the part that is overwhelmed, the part that can't speak, the part that just ... moves, still dancing. How the mystery endures. Today, the dancing plague has been featured in podcasts like Lore and Stuff You Should Know, novels and short stories, documentaries and history specials, memes and online creepypasta. It has become a part of pop culture as strange library of unsolved tales, but it is more than a curiosity. For those of us tired from modern chaos, sleepless nights, and invisible pressure, this story matters. It reminds us that exhaustion is not new, that the body sometimes cries out when the voice cannot, that movement can be both breakdown and breakthrough, and perhaps most importantly, it shows that even in moments of helplessness, there is humanity raw, unfiltered, undeniable. Closing reflections. The dance never ends. So now we return to that first woman in the hot streets of Strasbourg. She begins to sway, her feet bare against the stones. She doesn't know why. Her neighbors stare. She keeps moving. Hours pass, days, others join. The crowd grows. Music is added. Prayers are said. She dances. Not because she wants to, but because something in her must. We may never know exactly what began the dance or what ended it, but we know this: it is a story that refuses to be still. And like all great mysteries, it remains with us, whispering in the corners of history, reminding us of the dance beneath the surface of every life. The other side of the city, while peasants, merchants, and shoemakers danced themselves raw in the scorched streets of Strasbourg. Another world looked and elevated, both physically and metaphorically, high above the cobbled squares, in timbered mansions and stone manors. The wealthiest citizens of Strasbourg gathered behind glass and latticed balconies. These were the members of the city council, cathedral officials, merchants of the powerful Guild of Grain, and families who traced their lineage to the Holy Roman Empire itself. To them, the events unfolding below were a curiosity first, a threat second, and, finally, an opportunity, a day in the life of Strasbourg's elite. In 1518, Strasbourg was a wealthy imperial free city, governed not by a singular monarch, but by a city council composed of patricians, guild leaders, and noble families. These men ruled over trade, policy, and religious life. Their homes were insulated from the chaos of the outer city. Marble-floored halls, ornate tapestries, and imported Italian glass windows spoke of commerce and influence. They drank wine from the Rhineland, wore velvet from Bruges, and attended concerts of lute and pipe in private salons. Mornings began with deliberations, usually regarding grain taxes or guild disputes. Afternoons often included a walk in the cloister gardens or an inspection of city projects. Meals were served by house servants, and even the bread differed from what the lower class could afford, made from finer wheat and baked in private ovens. These people did not see the world the same way the dancers did, and when they first heard the rumors of a woman swaying in the street, they responded not with panic, but with bemused detachment, fascination, and discomfort. City officials at first treated the event as a public oddity. They documented it in administrative records, but with a tone of clinical detachment. After all, Strasbourg had seen religious processions, street preachers, and drunken brawls before. What made this different, however, was that it didn't stop. Days passed, then weeks. What began with one woman grew to dozens. Bodies shuddered and collapsed. Dancers tore their clothes and scraped their feet to the bone, yet kept moving. Music had to be summoned to soothe them. Priests began whispering about curses. Physicians argued over humors, and still they danced. From the upper levels of their homes, the elite watched with fascination, peering from behind embroidered curtains. Some sent servants to report updates. Others ventured to observe more directly, stepping down into the square, not as participants, but as spectators. It was entertainment at first. Then it became unsettling, because the longer the dancing continued, the more it forced a question the elite didn't want to face. What exactly was this? And could it spread upward? A problem for the council. By mid-July 1518, the ruling council could no longer ignore the plague. The affected quarter near the river Ill was now filled with constant motion. People wept, screamed, collapsed, and rose again. Bodies piled. The city's reputation was at stake, and more urgently, its economy. Merchants avoided certain streets. Travelers spread the story beyond the city walls. Rumors of possession and punishment were growing. The council feared that Strasbourg might become known not as a center of trade and learning, but as a city of madmen. Thus began a series of interventions, though none of them were particularly effective. They tried religious processions. They tried banning dancing. They tried summoning more musicians. They even tried building a stage and hiring pipers to play the dancers into collapse. And all the while, they met in the council chambers, drinking sweet wine, discussing policy, hoping, perhaps, that the madness would burn itself out like a fire left to die. But it didn't. Detached, but not immune. It would be easy to think the elite were untouched by the plague, and, in one sense, that's true. Few, if any, nobles or council members joined the dancers. Their wealth insulated them physically, just as their education insulated them intellectually. But that didn't mean they were immune. They were afraid, not of dancing, but of what it represented. This was a breakdown of order, a public shattering of decorum, a manifestation of something ancient and unpredictable. Even the most logical minds of the era trained in Aristotelian science or scholastic theology had no answer for what they were seeing. So they turned, as all do in uncertainty, to control. Control the narrative, control the bodies, control the streets. What began as fascination became repression. The dancers were beaten, removed, isolated. Priests were sent in, orders issued, shrines restored. It was an attempt to put the genie back in the bottle, to remind the city and themselves that the world still made sense, even as their own hearts whispered otherwise. Conclusion of Part 1. Shadows cast by wealth. The dancing plague of 1518 revealed two cities in one, a city of motion and desperation, lived in the open where bodies broke under the weight of invisible burdens, and a city of silence and observation, lived behind windows and council doors where power tried to define what could not be understood. In the next part, we'll explore how the church and ruling class used spiritual and political authority to interpret, manage, and ultimately reshape the story of the plague, for better or worse. Because when fear dances into the streets, those in power must decide. Will they listen to the music or try to silence it? When God was the only answer in the early 16th century, Strasbourg was more than a political power. It was a deeply religious city, steeped in Catholic orthodoxy, holy ritual, and centuries of ecclesiastical tradition. Even among the elite, no amount of wealth could buy immunity from the fear of divine punishment. So when dozens of commoners began dancing uncontrollably in the streets, many within the clergy and noble class interpreted it not as madness or sickness, but as divine wrath made visible. The official explanation was moral failing. The people were sinful, debased, and spiritually weak. Their dancing was not a mystery, it was a message, a rebuke from heaven, but restoring the soul of a city that had, in their eyes, fallen from grace. The curse of Saint Vitus, the most commonly accepted belief among the Strasbourg clergy, was that the dancers had been cursed by Saint Vitus, a martyr from the 4th century, who by this time had developed a reputation as the patron saint of epilepsy, madness, and chorea, the very symptoms the dancers displayed. According to local lore, those who offended the saint through impiety, pride, or unconfessed sin would be struck with Vita's dance, a condition that drove them to tremble, convulse, or dance without end. For the elite, this interpretation was comforting. It placed the blame on the people, not on the failures of governance, inequality, or trauma. It framed the crisis as a problem of morality, not health. More importantly, it gave them a ritual solution. Appease the saint, restore public order, and the plague would end. And so they began to act. Processions, penance, and public spectacle. By late July, church officials organized a formal response. Chanting monks and relics of Saint Vitus carried through the streets. The message was clear. This was not a disease. This was a punishment, and only spiritual humility could lift it. Council members funded masses. Wealthy patrons donated silver to the church. Fasting was encouraged citywide. Confession booths overflowed. In a striking moment of theatrical penitence, a group of dancers were escorted by armed guards to the shrine of Saint Vitus in the Vosges Mountains. It was an exorcism in motion, a final act of submission, and some say it worked. Reports claim that many of those taken to the shrine ceased dancing shortly after, whether due to the spiritual experience or simply removal from the social contagion of the city. The elite saw this as confirmation. The curse had lifted. Their judgment had been correct. God was still in control, and so were they. Medicine meets the cross, but not everyone agreed. Some described it as an imbalance of humors. Others pointed to environmental causes, like hot blood or corrupted vapors. City leaders had to choose. Would they trust the physicians, who offered no cure, or the priests, who offered absolution? In the end, they chose both. Physicians were paid to observe the dancers and recommend treatments, bleeding, purging, or rest. Priests were empowered to preach repentance and lead rituals. Musicians were even hired to guide the dancers toward collapse, believing the movement might run its course. For the rich, this combination of science and superstition was ideal. It covered all angles. It kept appearances intact. 1518 was just a year before Martin Luther's 95 Theses would ignite the Protestant Reformation. Across the Holy Roman Empire, whispers of corruption, indulgence, and ecclesiastical excess were growing louder. The dancing plague, ironically, became a chance for Strasbourg's clergy to prove their relevance. By tying the epidemic to divine justice, they reminded the city, especially its ruling elite, that they were the interpreters of cosmic will. In sermons, they spoke of obedience. In council meetings, they advised caution. In private letters, they reminded nobles of their spiritual obligations. The line between religious concern and political maneuvering was thin, and while many priests were no doubt sincere, the institutional church also benefited from the plague in a way the poor never did. Fear breeds control, and control breeds power. Conclusion of Part 2. Sacred Scripts and Silent Fear. To the average citizen, the dancing plague was a nightmare. To the poor, it was terror, confusion, and exhaustion. But to the elite, to the bishops in stone towers and councilmen in velvet robes, it was something else entirely. A test of influence, a performance of faith, a moment to redefine order in their favor. In the next part, we'll explore how certain members of the upper-class musicians, physicians, and clergy profited from the chaos, turning disaster into opportunity. Because, in Strasbourg, 1518, fear may have danced but money always walked. The dance becomes a stage. There is a dark reality. In times of chaos, someone always profits. By the time the dancing plague of 1518 had reached its frenzied peak, it was more than a medical or spiritual crisis. It had become a spectacle, one that attracted all manner of opportunists, entertainers, clergy, physicians, even peddlers selling so-called holy charms. And standing quietly behind these characters were the city's elite, funding, organizing, and sometimes encouraging the show, not always out of cruelty, but out of belief that order could be bought, that distraction was safer than confrontation, and yes, sometimes, because there was money to be made, music for misery. In an irony almost too dark to imagine, Strasbourg's council, composed of wealthy merchants and guild representatives, hired musicians to accompany the dancers. The logic was Galenic. If the affliction was due to overheated blood or overactive spirits, perhaps dancing it out would vent the madness. Music would guide the energy, exhaust it. So players of lutes, flutes, drums, and fiddles were summoned. These weren't just street musicians. Many were employed by noble patrons, part of the city's thriving cultural life. They were paid in coin, nobles' coin, to stand in squares and perform beside people collapsing of exhaustion, bleeding from their feet. It was part medical remedy, part macabre theater. Some musicians likely recoiled at the task. Others, facing their own economic hardships, simply did what was asked. They played while people died. They were paid well. And for the elite who arranged it, it was an elegant solution. Entertainment masked as treatment. Order through harmony, all without ever dirtying one's hands. Healers with silver tongues, physicians, too, found their moment. The elite had access to the best-educated medical minds in Strasbourg, trained at universities in Paris, Padua, and Heidelberg. These doctors practiced humoral theory, astrology, and even early forms of psychological observation. When the dancing plague began, these physicians were summoned not to cure, but to classify, observe, and ultimately reassure. They published treatises, they advised the council, they issued opinions, sometimes contradictory, sometimes vague, but for every word they spoke, for every prescription of bloodletting or rest, they were paid handsomely. And while many of them likely felt powerless before the spectacle of involuntary movement and suffering, their social status rose. They became interpreters of mystery, and their reputations grew among the upper class. In a way, the plague solidified their position not as saviors, but as men who had answers when others had only fear. Holy water and hollow promises not to be outdone. The church also found a market. Relics of St. Vitus were in high demand. Holy water, sold at a premium, was sprinkled over homes. Tiny charms crosses, medallions, bits of cloth touched by saints were exchanged for donations. The common people, desperate for protection, bought what they could afford. The wealthy often sponsored mass purchases, distributing them through clergy in acts of apparent generosity. But behind the scenes, a commerce of fear was blooming. It wasn't always sinister. Many priests believed in their rituals, but the structure of the medieval church, deeply entwined with land, ownership, and political power, meant that faith and finance were never fully separate. Wealth flowed upward. Dancers collapsed. The city prayed, and the coffers of abbeys and bishoprics grew heavier. The gossip economy, even beyond music, medicine, and religion. The plague created a social economy of rumorand that benefited the upper class. Tales of dancing were carried beyond Strasbourg to cities like Basel, Mainz, and even Paris. Wealthy travelers, diplomats, and merchants repeated the story in courts and drawing rooms, always with a tone of detached amusement. Did you hear what's happening in Alsace? They're dancing themselves to death. Surely it's some curse. How peculiar. For those far away, it became a novelty, a conversation piece. For those nearby, it became currency. Artists sold woodcut illustrations of dancers. Writers penned pamphlets, some factual, others grotesque. Certain city elites even hosted guests on balconies, offering a view of the afflicted. Dignified suffering turned into a grotesque form of medieval tourism. The more people talked, the more prestige surrounded those who knew the story firsthand. In this, knowledge itself became a commodity, controlled, curated, and traded by those with access. The disparity becomes visible. While the rich observed, discussed, and capitalized, the poor continued to suffer. Mothers danced while children wept nearby. Laborers collapsed on cobblestones. Servants found themselves without masters as fear closed down households. And all the while, above them, the balconies were full. This stark contrast between the dancing masses and the watching classes deepened the social divide in Strasbourg. Where once the elite had been viewed as protectors and benefactors, some now began to see them as indifferent, detached, or even exploitative. In the years that followed, these perceptions would help fuel Reformation sentiments, as common people sought new models of leadership, ones based not on privilege, but proximity, shared suffering, and justice. The dancing plague had pulled back the curtain, and not everyone liked what they saw. Conclusion of Part 3. Where the money moved in every disaster, there are those who fall and those who rise. In Strasbourg, 1518, the dancers fell physically, mentally, spiritually. Nobles with information. This was not a conspiracy. It wasn't orchestrated cruelty, but it was in every sense, a redistribution of wealth through fear. And in the final part of this section, we'll explore how even the rich and insulated, observant, powerful, were not completely immune to the strange, spiraling dance they watched from their towers. Because sometimes the music finds you. The illusion of distance for weeks. The elite of Strasbourg had watched the dancers from afar, curious, disturbed, but untouched. From behind stone walls and thick curtains, they told themselves the usual story. This was a poor man's problem, born of hunger, superstition, and spiritual fragility. They were safe behind their status, their Latin scriptures, their physicians, and their hired guards. And sometimes they came too close. When the doors would not close as the plague spread, dancers moved from the marketplaces into alleys, then into wealthier quarters. Not because they targeted the rich, but because their movement had become chaotic, impossible to contain. Some reports described servants of noble households who began to dance. One chambermaid is said to have collapsed in a noble garden, her shoes worn through and her hands bleeding. In another tale, a minor council official's son began exhibiting tremors after watching the dancers from a balcony for hours. Whether it was true dancing mania or hysteria, it frightened his family deeply. A physician was called, a priest. He was quickly sent to a monastery to recover. The message spread quickly. Proximity was danger. Soon, wealthy households sealed their gates, refused guests, and increased guard patrols. Religious relics were nailed above doorways. Kitchens prepared purifying herbs and protective potions. The illusion of distance was gone. Now, the elite saw something they had not wanted to see before. This plague had no respect for status. A council in panic. By early August, the Strasbourg City Council, composed largely of patricians and merchant elites, was divided. One faction insisted on continued religious interventions. Another demanded stricter quarantine laws. A third advocated for the hiring of more musicians to literally play out the affliction. In the records that survive, there's an air of confusion. Memos contradict. Orders are reversed. Physicians contradict clergy. Priests contradict each other. Behind it all, a single shared fear. What if it comes for us? Some council members began leaving the city for country estates. Others sent their children away. One prominent merchant reportedly kept a musician playing in his courtyard day and night, believing the rhythm would cleanse the air. The rich, who had always imagined themselves as controllers of fate, now found themselves controlled by the fear of it. Rumors in the halls of power. With fear came suspicion. Whispers began. Perhaps it was caused by the guilds. Maybe a foreign merchant brought it. What if the Jews were behind it again? Even among the elite, paranoia took hold. Past persecutions resurfaced in frightened conversation. Nobles accused rivals of sorcery. Wives accused husbands of inviting God's wrath. The dancing plague became a mirror, reflecting the insecurities and fractures already present in elite society. And that mirror showed something terrifying. That power could not always protect. That fear was an equalizer. That the body, regardless of social class, could betray you in ways no guard or coin could stop. A noblewoman's collapse. One story stands out from late in the plague's timeline. Though its details vary in retellings, the essence remains. A noblewoman, likely in her 30s, was said to have watched the dancers from her second-story window for hours every day. She was fascinated, some say obsessed. She began mimicking their movements in private, at first as a joke, then as a ritual. Days later, she did not stop. Her household tried to calm her, to restrain her, but she moved endlessly through the halls. Her physician declared it melancholic hysteria. A priest performed rites. Nothing worked. She danced until she collapsed, unconscious, her feet blackened, her breathing shallow. She survived barely. She was sent to a nunnery. Her name was erased from many records. Her family, ashamed, denied it ever happened. But those who lived in Strasbourg remembered. She became a symbol. If it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. When the music stopped by late August, the epidemic began to recede. The musicians were dismissed. The dancing slowed. Survivors scarred, broken, some permanently disfigured returned. The elite declared victory. They held masses of thanksgiving. Some commissioned paintings or tapestries depicting the chaos. Council members made public statements, but behind the formality, a deep unease lingered. They had seen something they could not unsee. The madness of the streets had crept up the walls of their houses. It had laughed in the face of wealth, danced through marble corridors, and turned power into panic. And though it was gone, it had changed the city anthem. The dance in the tower, the dancing plague of 1518, wasn't just a tragedy for the poor. It was a revelation for the rich. It showed that no amount of money, no network of influence, no high-walled estate could stop a force that flowed through culture, faith, trauma, and fear. It was a dance of the body, but also a dance of the mind, of society's deepest fractures revealed in spasms and collapsed lungs. And those in the towers saw it, finally, for what it was. A story that could just as easily have ended in their own hallways, because in Strasbourg, even privilege was not immune to the music. Life beside the beasts in the year 1518. Strasbourg was alive with noise not only from the voices of merchants, the hammering of blacksmiths, or the whispers of priests, but from the constant surrounding chorus of animals. Dogs barked in alleyways, chickens clucked through open courtyards, oxen groaned under wooden yokes, and the braying of donkeys echoed through the winding streets. Animals were not decorations. They were not background details. They were a part of daily life, as essential as firewood or bread. They served, suffered, and sometimes comforted. Some were revered, others were feared. And in the weeks when people began to dance themselves to death, these creatures became silent observers, and, in some cases, unwilling participants in Strasbourg's darkest rhythm. Dogs in the city, the streets of Strasbourg, teemed with dogs, some owned, some strays, many somewhere in between. Small breeds, like the gray Italian lapdog, favored by noble women, lived pampered lives inside manor kitchens and upstairs chambers. These dogs were often curled on velvet pillows, occasionally fed from silver dishes, and seen as gentle companions and status symbols. They wore ribbons, they had names, but far more common were the mongrel hounds, lean and scrappy, kept by tradesmen or allowed to roam. They lived off scraps, hunted vermin, and in many cases provided protection. They barked at strangers, followed carts, and slept near ovens for warmth. Some were fiercely loyal, an extension of the family. Others were barely tolerated. And then there were the truly feral pack screechers of the night, eyes glowing in alleyways, waiting for the butcher's waste or the baker's dropped crust. These dogs lived on the margins of the city's compassion, yet they were part of its soul. When the dancing began, dogs were confused. They circled the dancers. Some barked, some ran. A few tried to nip at twirling limbs. Others whined, pacing nervously. Stories emerged of dogs following their masters through days of compulsive movement, finally curling beside them when they collapsed. They did not understand the plague, but they sensed the rupture. And when their owners didn't come home, many of them simply waited. Some howled through the night. Though today, cats are often cherished as companions, in medieval and early modern Europe, they were symbols of both protection and danger. They were feared, venerated, and sometimes blamed for evil. House cats were kept in some homes for practical reasons. They were rat hunters, agile and efficient. In granaries and kitchens, they were valued allies, but they were also viewed with suspicion, especially black cats, which were associated with witchcraft. Their silence, their nocturnal ways, their unblinking eyes all gave them a supernatural air. The church had long painted them as demonic familiars, especially in times of plague or crop failure. During the dancing plague, rumors arose of cats watching dancers with too much attention. One tale speaks of a baker's cat that followed its mistress as she danced into the market and back again, only leaving her side when she finally collapsed. The neighbors whispered afterward that the cat had bewitched her. Cats were burned, occasionally in symbolic rituals meant to purge bad luck. But for every tale of suspicion, there were stories of comfort. In many homes, cats curled beside exhausted children or rested near hearths while mothers wept over possessed husbands. They were witnesses, watchers, stillness incarnate in a city overcome by motion. The birds in the rafters. If dogs were the muscle of the city and cats the mystery, then birds were the ambient life. They flew, perched, and sang over Strasbourg like musical punctuation. Chickens, of course, were everywhere, scuttling across courtyards, darting between people's feet, roosting in baskets. Their clucks and flaps were part of morning routines. Eggs were a staple of every class's diet, and their feathers used for bedding and clothing. But other birds made their homes in Strasbourg too. Pigeons nested in the eaves of churches and merchant houses. They were symbols of peace, but also messengers. Trained birds were used to carry notes between towns. More than one child believed that a pigeon could deliver a prayer. Crows and ravens, always ominous, lingered near the edges of town, watching. In folklore, they were harbingers of death, speaking the names of the doomed. In reality, they feasted on waste and decay. As the plague intensified, people began to listen to birds more closely. Superstitions flared. The call of a raven at the wrong hour could cause panic. A sudden flock of pigeons rising from a rooftop was seen as a sign of divine warning. Even birds became woven into the narrative of fear, and still they flew. Horses, oxen, and donkeys. The engines of labor. Strasbourg's streets echoed with the clip-clop of horses' hooves, the snort of oxen, and the slow bray of donkeys pulling carts. These were not animals of affections. They were engines, owned and used for hauling, plowing, transporting, and building. Noblemen rode proud stallions. Merchants used mules to drag goods. Farmers brought their oxen to town to trade, their great shoulders straining beneath wooden yokes. To the poor, animals like these were wealth-living tools, passed down, traded, and mourned when they died. During the plague, many of these animals went hungry or overworked. Some pulled carts bearing collapsed dancers to the steps of churches or the hills outside the city. Others were forced to walk near the dancers themselves, as if the sound of hooves could break the spell. One account tells of an ox refusing to move when a dancer collapsed in front of it, standing over the woman as if in silent protection. Even beasts of burden, it seemed, could sense that something had gone wrong in the human world. Rats and the unseen. It would be impossible to discuss the animals of a plague-struck city without mentioning rats. Though the 1518 event wasn't bubonic in nature, Strasbourg's people lived in perpetual memory of plague, and rats were part of that fear. Seen as carriers of disease, filth, and pestilence, rats lived in the shadows of barns, latrines, sewers, and storage cellars. They were nearly impossible to eradicate. Cats hunted them, dogs killed them, children threw stones. But still, they came nibbling grain, scuttling through pantries, nesting in hay. Some whispered that the rats came in greater numbers as the dancers appeared, that they followed the madness, that they fed off it. Whether real or imagined, their presence was always a bad omen. They were part of the background machinery of medieval life, just as inevitable and persistent as fear itself. Animals as omens in Strasbourg's world. Animals were not just creatures, they were messages. A white hare crossing the road might signal divine favor. A three-legged dog could be a devil in disguise. A cow refusing to give milk might mean the house had been cursed. In the early days of the dancing plague, when logic failed and prayers went unanswered, people looked to animals for signs. A cat refusing to eat meant death was near. A dog howling at the moon marked another dancer lost. A rooster crowing after dark foretold disaster. These beliefs weren't foolishness, they were coping mechanisms, ancient ways of mapping meaning onto chaos. And so, as humans danced in agony, animals became mirrors, reflecting back the terror that could not be named. The city of Strasbourg was never just human. Its streets were filled with paws, hooves, feathers, and claws. Its nights echoed with whinnies, howls, and caws, and its fears, when they rose, were often shaped by the behavior of the animals that shared the land. In the shadow of the dancing plague, these creatures stood alongside their human counterparts, some serving, some suffering, some simply witnessing. And in the next part of our journey, we will explore how animals were drawn into the human struggle for meaning, becoming participants in rituals, offerings, and the desperate search for peace in a city gone mad. The world of living symbols in early 16th century Strasbourg, people viewed animals through a symbolic lens. Every creature had meaning, often layered with both biblical interpretation and folk wisdom passed down orally for generations. Animals were woven into Christian morality tales, pagan remnants, and daily rituals that blended fear with reverence. Unlike modern secular views of animals as companions or wildlife, 1518 citizens saw moral messages in every beak, claw, and tail. The lamb symbolized Christ. The serpent was temptation. The dove meant peace and the Holy Spirit. The wolf warned of heresy and sin. These symbolic meanings weren't abstract. They shaped how people interacted with animals every day. A black rooster crowing at midnight wasn't just a nuisance. It could be a sign of witchcraft. A fox seen near a church might signal a demon in disguise. In times of crisis, like the dancing plague, people became more sensitive to these signs. Every creature was a potential harbinger of doom, healing, or judgment. The curse of the goat. One of the more persistent local legends of Alsace during the early 1500s was the tale of the goat of Saint Verena. The story went like this. A humble weaver's wife had a goat who could speak. She whispered secrets at night, telling the woman where to find lost coins, or which neighbor's bread would rise or fall. One day, the woman followed the goat's advice and grew wealthy. But when the priest discovered the animal's powers, he claimed it was possessed. The goat was taken to the town square and burned as a witch. Afterward, the family lost everything, and soon the townsfolk said strange fits began to overtake the city. This tale, though likely folkloric, reflects deeper anxieties about animals in the supernatural realm. Goats, in particular, were viewed with suspicion, especially black ones. Their horns, cloven hooves, and stubbornness tied them in the popular imagination to Satan himself. In Strasbourg, some believed the dancing plague had been unleashed by such an animal. A few accused local farms of harboring cursed livestock. Farmers whose animals died suddenly or behaved oddly were sometimes shunned or questioned by clergy. Even innocent animals, through centuries of myth, could become scapegoats, literally saints, and their animal companions. Not all animals in Christian lore were evil. Some were blessed, seen as signs of divine favor, especially when linked to the saints. One of the more popular local saints in Alsace was Saint Gertrude of Nevels, known as the protector against rats and mental illness. Often depicted with a cat at her side, she was invoked by those fearful of both madness and disease. During the outbreak, some Strasbourg citizens hung images of Saint Gertrude near their homes. Others placed bowls of milk for her symbolic cat, hoping to ward off madness. It may seem quaint now, but to them it was a spiritual defense, a call to heaven through a feline gatekeeper. Likewise, Saint Raku, protected against plague, was often depicted with a loyal dog who licked his wounds and brought him bread. People who had dogs would bless them, sometimes placing holy water on their foreheads, or offering extra scraps in homage to Saint Roch's divine companion. These beliefs were in T-fringe. They were part of a rich religious tradition, where animals served as intermediaries between God and man. When the dancing began, many turned to these animal-linked saints for help, lighting candles, whispering prayers, and even bringing animals to church steps to be blessed. The dancing animals, legend or reality. As the madness gripped the city, stories began to circulate, some strange, others surreal, of animals joining in the dancing. A few chroniclers, writing years later, mentioned tales of a donkey at the edge of the city that walked in circles for 3 days without rest, a flock of birds that mimicked the movements of the dancers from above, swooping and diving in odd patterns, a hunting dog owned by a nobleman who refused to eat for a week and barked only at music. Even a bear, said to have escaped a traveling entertainer's cage, who wandered into a gathering of dancers, spun on its hind legs, and left silently. These stories likely grew in the telling, as all folklore does, but their existence shows how deeply people connected the dancing plague to the unnatural behaviors of the animal world. In medieval cosmology, when the natural world, man, beast, weather, stars moved out of balance, it meant spiritual imbalance. That even animals behaved oddly meant to many that the world had truly gone wrong. It's worth asking, did the people truly see these things? Or were they projecting their own confusion onto the only silent witnesses left? Animal sacrifice and folk rituals. In remote villages outside Strasbourg proper, where folk practices blended with official religion, some people turned to ancient methods for cleansing madness from the land. One of the oldest rituals involved the sacrifice of a rooster at a crossroads. Blood would be spilled onto the earth, and the bird buried with herbs and silver coins. This was believed to draw out evil spirits or dance demons. Another involved leading a goat or a black dog through the streets while chanting psalms. Backward a practice meant to confuse the demon and lead it away from the afflicted. While these practices were condemned by the church, they were quietly performed, especially by midwives, herb women, or elder men known for weather reading or word charms. Some Strasbourg citizens, out of desperation, took to performing these rites secretly. They buried bones, hung horse teeth over doorways, and whispered prayers to animals long dead. In one case, a family reportedly slaughtered their only ox, believing it had been cursed by watching their daughter dance for too long. They left its carcass outside the city, hoping to break the spell. Such acts may seem tragic or primitive now, but to the people of 1518, they were acts of control in a time of absolute chaos, animal dreams and night terrors. As the plague wore on, those who didn't dance began to suffer in other ways: nightmares, insomnia, strange visions. Many people reported dreaming of animals, snakes curled around their necks, dogs with human eyes, flocks of birds pecking at their limbs. These dreams were interpreted through dream books, which were popular tools among both clergy and laity. According to one Alsatian dream book from the 1400s, to dream of a fox meant betrayal, a snake meant secrets, a cat meant illness, especially of the mind, a white horse meant death in the family. Priests and wise women were called upon to interpret dreams. They advised cleansing rituals, fasting, or reciting specific verses. People even changed their sleeping arrangements, moving beds away from barn walls, or tying red threads around animal pens to block the influence of dreams. This emphasis on animal symbolism in dreams shows how deeply intertwined animal life was with mental and spiritual states. The boundaries between animal and human, real and symbolic, were porous. When the human mind broke under the pressure of illness and fear, it reached out to the familiar forms of animals to give shape to its terrors. In 1518, Strasbourg animals were not just bystanders to the dancing plague. They were part of the symbolic vocabulary through which people made sense of crisis. They were scapegoats, saints, companions, omens, and actors in spiritual dramas that blurred the line between heaven, earth, and hell. From sacred cats to sacrificial roosters, from dreams to rituals, animals gave form to the unseeable forces that people believed surrounded them. In trying to understand madness, many looked to the creatures that lived silently beside them. And in the next part of our story, we'll explore how animals became participants in healing through medicine, companionship, and even ritual intervention. We'll ask, could animals help cure the dancers? Could they protect those still untouched? Stay with us for Part 3, Fur and Fever, Healing with Animals. Companions in sickness beyond their bodies and byproducts. Animals served another vital role during epidemics, like the dancing plague. They were companions in suffering. In Strasbourg, some families allowed lapdogs or house cats to stay close to afflicted dancers. It wasn't just affection or superstition, it was belief in transference, in the creature's ability to pull illness away with its presence. Dogs were often referred to as soul soothers, a term used by Alsatian herbalists of the period. Small breeds, such as the Blenheim Spaniel or Toy Terriers, were favored. Not only could they rest on the laps or chests of the sick, their warm, rhythmic breathing was thought to calm the wild humors. There were even accounts of people dying peacefully while their dog laid beside them, the frenzied movement gradually fading under the animal's calming touch. Cats, meanwhile, were both feared and revered. Though often associated with witchcraft, they were considered sensitive to spiritual disturbances. A cat that hissed near a dancer might be seen as a warning. One that curled near a fevered patient was seen as protective. One Strasbourg story told of a dancer whose seizures ceased only when his black cat slept on his chest, purring steadily. Birds had their place. Two canaries, nightingales, and larks were brought into homes to sing near the afflicted. The belief was that their natural melodies might recalibrate the senses, much like tuning a disordered instrument. Some even believed birds could carry prayers to heaven faster than words spoken by human lips. In many cases, these animal presences offered not cure, but comfort hand in a time of madness that could mean everything: sacrifice and the transference of illness. Desperation leads to ancient impulses. In Strasbourg and nearby villages, some communities resorted to symbolic animal sacrifice rituals meant to carry illness away from humans. The most common ritual involved the scapegoat technique. As dark fur was seen as absorbing, and it would be spoken over by priests or healers. They would name the illness aloud and symbolically transfer it into the creature through ritualized touch or breath. The animal would then be driven from town, left in the forest, or, in more extreme cases, burned at a crossroads. A 16th-century priest from Haguenau wrote of a ritual involving a pig dressed in a child's tunic, dragged in circles around a church while villagers chanted. The pig, dazed and confused, was then slaughtered at sunset. The dancers were said to have slowed their motions in the hours that followed. Whether it was belief, placebo, or coincidence is impossible to say. Sometimes the animal proxy was not a real beast at all, but a representation. Paper, amateur, animals were burned during festivals, and once, in Strasbourg, a life-size wooden horse was paraded through the square, its flanks painted with verses from Psalms. Inside its hollow belly were the shoes of a dozen dancers' items, believed to contain the sickness. Though these practices are shocking by modern standards, they reflect an intuitive understanding of symbolic healing. These people were not fools. They were terrified, with no recourse to science, turning instead to story, to spectacle, and to the primal theater of life and death. Saint Roch, for instance, was said to have survived plague in the wilderness, thanks to a loyal dog who brought him bread each day. Paintings of Roch almost always feature this dog, and copies were circulated widely in Alsace during the 1518 outbreak. Pilgrims visited small shrines dedicated to Saint Roch and left offerings of dog bones or carved wooden dogs, hoping to appeal for the same healing loyalty. Other saints, like Saint Anthony and Saint Hubert, were evoked in ceremonies where animals were blessed and led through town. In one account, a healer led a procession of dogs to the steps of Strasbourg Cathedral, each wearing a ribbon soaked in holy water. Behind them followed the afflicted, hoping to walk in the footsteps of the blessed beasts. Relics also played a role. Holy Paw, a desiccated dog, S-Paw, encased in silver, and said to have belonged to a monastery mutt that once healed a bishop's seizures by licking his hand during prayer. While skeptics scoffed, believers came from miles to touch the relic, praying it might slow their uncontrollable dancing. Animal masks, festivals, and the theater of healing. As the plague dragged on, public rituals grew increasingly dramatic. Local guilds began organizing festivals meant to mirror and mock the dancing itself. Animal masks became a central part of this public theater. Boar masks, lion heads, deer antlers all crafted from papier, clay, or leather were worn by dancers who mimicked the plague's symptoms in exaggerated parody. This wasn't mockery of the victims, but a ritualized containment of fear. By making the sickness ridiculous or fantastical, the community could regain a sliver of control over it. During the annual feast of St. Vitus, such performances reached a fever pitch. One account from 1519 describes masked figures wearing donkey ears and rooster tails, dancing backward through the cathedral square to the jeers and applause of villagers. A symbolic dancer would be caught by an animal-masked priest and doused with lavender oil before collapsing, healed. Though strange to modern minds, these performances served a communal psychological function. Fear was ritualized, grief was expressed, hope was performed. Creatures of comfort, animal companions in daily life. Beyond ritual and folklore, the most enduring role of animals was their quiet presence in everyday life. As dancers collapsed, as families mourned, animals remained silent, loyal, enduring. One diary fragment from an Alsatian farmer describes how his wife, struck by the plague, would only sleep with her goat by her side. The goat's slow breathing calmed her, and she would stroke its coarse hair during lucid moments. The farmer wrote, "I do not know if it cured her, but she danced less." Perhaps she was not so alone. The importance of animals in recovery wasn't just physical, it was spiritual and emotional. They offered no judgment. They made no demands. They stayed. Echoes in modern medicine. Today, we know the benefits of therapy animals and emotional support creatures. Dogs are trained to detect seizures. Horses are used in trauma therapy. Cats are placed in hospice care. The instincts of the people of Strasbourg weren't entirely misplaced. They simply lacked the language we now have to explain it. But more importantly, they remind us of something eternal. When chaos reigns, when suffering stretches beyond comprehension, we turn to the soft, steady presence of the creatures who share our homes and our hearts. Whether chasing away fever dreams or resting beside the dying, the animals of Strasbourg were healers in their own right. If you've enjoyed this journey into the gentler side of plague history, be sure to follow History for the Tired for more soothing, long-form stories that bring the past to life even in its strangest moments. Feathers, furs, and fiefs, animal care and class in the age of the plague. Exploring the role of animals among the elite during the 1518 dancing madness. A different world behind walls, while Strasbourg's commoners danced themselves to collapse in the hot summer streets. A very different reality unfolded behind the high walls and shaded gardens of the noble estates. Here, in grand stone manors, surrounded by hunting parks, animals played a vastly different role, not as healers or companions of the sick, but as symbols of status, refinement, and divine order. The noble class, during the early 16th century, lived in a world that was deeply hierarchical, not only in its human structures, but in its relationship to nature. For them, animals were arranged in a vertical chain, from the majestic lion at the top to the lowly peasant pig at the bottom. This great chain of being, as it was later called, informed how nobles interacted with their animals. Falcons wore gilded hoods. Greyhounds slept on velvet cushions. Exotic birds chirped in gilded cages from Italy. Even household cats in noble homes were rare and selectively bred, their coats combed and their movements recorded in household ledgers like prized objects. When plague or madness swept through the city, nobles saw animals not as agents of healing, but as potential carriers of contagion or worse, carriers of bad omens. This part of the story explores how the animal-human relationship was shaped by privilege, distance, and a very different kind of fear. Let me now continue writing this part to reach the 6,000-word target. Due to length, this will be delivered in multiple parts. The elite and their beasts, to truly understand how the nobility interacted with animals during the time of the dancing plague. We must step inside their manners and observe the highly ritualized world they built around their creatures. Unlike the peasants, who relied on dogs and goats as practical helpers or emotional companions, nobles prized animals for entirely different reasons. Let us begin with the falcon, the ultimate symbol of noble prestige. Falconry was not only a sport, it was a statement. Birds of prey were reserved for the upper classes by law in many regions. A falcon signaled wealth, discipline, and lineage. In Strasbourg's elite circles, falconry became even more prominent during the outbreak. As the streets below filled with desperate dancers, nobles took to the hills and forests, holding hawking tournaments and riding out on hunts. There are even records of falcons being trained to respond to whistles that mimicked the musical cadence of the dance rhythms, an eerie reminder of the chaos that gripped the city below. Inside the manor walls, animals such as lapdogs and miniature spaniels provided companionship, but they were seen less as emotional supports and more as living ornaments. Many noblewomen kept embroidered pillows for their dogs, and some commissioned portraits with their favorite pets at their feet. Rare luxuries in an age where painting was reserved for the elite. But even among the nobility, animals were not merely passive symbols. During the plague, they became part of a carefully managed strategy to remain untouched by disease. Dogs were bathed in perfumed water and rubbed with herbal mixtures meant to protect against miasmas or bad air. Cats were fed only from gilded dishes to prevent them from picking up commoners' scraps. Horses were kept in stables where juniper and rosemary were burned to ward off invisible contagions. Nobles also feared the idea that animals could channel lower-class suffering into their refined households. There are instances where noble families had their animals rebloused by private chaplains, as if worried the beast had absorbed the sickness of a servant who fed it. This practice, called ritual reassurance, became especially popular in July of 1518. The peak of the dancing madness. These animals, though pampered, were treated not with affection, but with a kind of reverent control. They were adored, yes, but also feared. Feathers, furs, and fiefs, animal care and class in the age of the plague, privilege, and panic, though the nobility were far removed from the narrow alleys of Strasbourg's lower quarters. The plague's reach crept ever closer. Nobles were terrified, not just of disease itself, but of what it represented: chaos, disorder, and the unraveling of their tightly managed world. When dancers collapsed in convulsions or laughter on the cathedral steps, it wasn't just physical illness. The nobles feared it was the breach of class boundaries. The idea that madness could ripple upwards. Thus, they began to enforce distance, not only between themselves and the afflicted, but between their animals and the world beyond. In several households, grooms and servants who touched dogs, falcons, or horses were required to bathe and pray before re-entering the estate. One 1519 household ledger from a noble estate outside Strasbourg records the cost of replacing all straw, bedding, and bowls of the greyhound Beatrice, having been touched by footman Hans, whose brother did dance. More extreme cases abound. A noblewoman in Lorraine reportedly ordered the slaughter of all her estate. Cats when she saw one watching her child sleep, convinced it was harboring the same spirit that drove the peasants mad. Her surviving letters reveal a curious mixture of maternal protectiveness and spiritual dread. The beast's eyes burned with red light, she wrote. Surely it has drunk from the same well as the dancers. In contrast to the rural poor, who brought animals close for comfort, nobles sought separation and purification. Dogs and horses were ritually cleansed with water steeped in wormwood, lavender, sage, and angelica, the same herbs used to prepare the protective plague masks of physicians. Birds were relocated to isolated aviaries, and some households installed bells on animal cages, hoping the sound would frighten away evil humors or signal an animal's mood shift before it could infect the home. Animals were surveilled, observed, monitored like sacred relics or dangerous artifacts, where the peasantry saw animals as healers or protectors. The elite saw potential liabilities valued, yes, but always watched. The animal healers of the privileged. Yet even in this world of fear and separation, there were exception stories that remind us that compassion existed even among the powerful, and that animals could break through the rigid architecture of nobility. One such account comes from the journals of Countess Alinette de Montreux, who, during the height of the dancing plague, kept a silver-haired whippet named Marceau. Her writings describe how, during her own fever's weather, caused by fear or an undiagnosed infection, Marceau would rest at her feet. She came to believe the dog had a quieting hum which steadied her breath and kept the dreams of dancing specters at bay. She had an herbalist commission a lavender balm for the dog's coat, and servants were instructed to let Marceau lie near any family member who reported headaches, numbness, or twitching limbs. She even wrote to a bishop asking if animals could carry sainthood in the afterlife. If men carry sin, may dogs not carry grace. In another tale, a young noble boy, afflicted with hallucinations from an unknown fever, was said to have been calmed by the gaze of a white owl. His mother wrote that when the owl blinked, the boy's limbs stilled. Whether truth, illusion, or invention, such stories reflect the deep human longing for connection and the way animals, even in marble-floored halls, answered that call. Some physicians of the upper class began experimenting with controlled animal exposure. A Strasbourg doctor named Philippe wrote about curative proximity, placing healthy animals in rooms with noble patients to measure absorption or diffusion of humoral imbalance. Though his methods were unscientific by today's standards, his writings suggest a burgeoning awareness of the emotional and physiological benefits of animal presence. It's worth noting that the elite had access to a wider range of animals than the poor. Monkeys from the Iberian coast, peacocks from Italy, Persian cats, even parakeets and tiny turtles. Each was regarded with a mix of novelty and reverence. During the plague, some nobles surrounded themselves with their most unusual animals, hoping that exoticism would confer immunity, as if strangeness itself could protect them from the madness below. Symbols of power and control among the noble class. Animals were also used to project stability and order, even when fear gripped the world. Paintings from this period often show animals posed beside lords and ladies, not by accident, but by deliberate placement. The presence of a falcon, stag, or noble hound was a signifier. We are above the chaos. We are untouched. Tapestries made during or shortly after the dancing plague reveal fascinating details. One famous piece, housed in the Dl Gouvre Notre Dame, shows a noblewoman reclining in a garden, a lute in her hand, while a line of peasant dancers with twisted limbs passes in the distance. Beside her is a large greyhound, staring calmly. The implication is clear. Her animal mirrors her serenity, her power, her immunity. Such representations weren't mere decoration. They were psychological fortresses, symbols that the social order remained intact. But even these efforts were sometimes undercut by reality. There are scribbled notes on the back of noble inventories. Hounds nervous, horses restless, owls screeching at midday, which suggests that not even animals could mask the tremor of uncertainty. The nobles may have tried to appear unaffected, but their animals, ever sensitive to the emotional weather of their homes, sometimes betrayed them. The role of noble stables and exotic menageries, how class-based beliefs shaped animal lore, feathers, furs, and fiefs, animal care and class in the age of the plague, menageries, menials, and mythologies. While the average villager in Strasbourg might have kept a goat in the yard or a dog by the fire, nobles built entire menageries, private zoos that showcased exotic creatures brought from faraway lands. These were not only displays of wealth, but also meant to invoke power over nature itself. Animals behind gilded bars served as a manifestation of human dominion, a microcosm of order in an increasingly chaotic world. In the weeks following the first reports of the dancing madness, noble families who owned menageries, particularly those with creatures from the East or North Africa, ordered specially reinforced cages and increased surveillance of their animals. The belief was that exotic creatures, whose behaviors were poorly understood, might be harbingers or triggers of the plague. Some even speculated that birds from foreign shores carried dancing spirits in their songs. One chronicle from a minor noble estate near Strasbourg describes the death of a prized white peacock, followed by a servant girl's descent into trembling fits. Though it was likely coincidental, the peacock was buried in a ritual similar to human funerals, sealed in a wooden box, anointed with oils, and prayed over. The girl was sent to a convent. The care of these menagerie animals often fell to animal stewards, a lower class of servant, with the sole responsibility of feeding, grooming, and observing the beasts. During the plague, many of these men were forbidden to leave the estate, lest they carry the madness in with their boots or breath. Some lived in stables and menagerie lodges for weeks on end. But within these micro-worlds, animal behavior took on a strange weight. If a lynx began pacing or a parrot screeched too often, it might be seen as a premonition of death. If a gazelle refused food, the household priest might be summoned to bless the animal's stall. These interpretations were steeped in folk belief, even among the supposedly rational upper classes. In this time of upheaval, even nobles began to turn to animal omens, despite their education and disdain for peasant superstitions. A fox seen at dusk near the edge of an estate was a bad sign. An owl's cry in daylight, a cause for prayer. The social divide that normally kept superstition downstairs began to blur under the pressure of fear. Whose life was worth more? Perhaps the starkest contrast between noble and commoner in this period came not in how they loved their animals, but in how they valued their lives. A noble's hound might be insured for more coin than a peasant's life was worth in tax. When a favored hunting dog of Lord Heinrich of Kell died of a suspected illness during the plague. He had it buried in the family crypt. Just 1 month later, a stable boy who died of exhaustion from working the same kennels was buried in an unmarked grave outside the manor wall. This disparity was not unusual. Noble animals were investments, companions, and symbols of heritage. They were included in wills, given silver collars, and fed better than many villagers. And yet, in the desperate moments of July 15, 18, when some nobles fled the city altogether, animals were sometimes left behind, not out of cruelty, but from a belief that the disease might cling to fur or hide in hooves. In such cases, the very animals once exalted were now feared. Entire stables were locked, animals left to fend for themselves, some even released into the forests. In one haunting tale, a nobleman named Ulrich von Hallstatt released a prized pair of greyhounds into the Vosges mountains, believing they had absorbed the tremors from a sick maid. Legend says they were later seen roaming together, howling in rhythmic patterns as if dancing. Were these tales invented, embellished, perhaps? But they speak to something very real: the terror of contamination, the breakdown of trust between humans and their beloved beasts, the illusion of control for the nobility. Animals had long been tools of controlling land, controlling lineage, controlling image. But as the plague blurred lines between rich and poor, sane and mad, health and affliction, even that control unraveled. We find hints of this shift in household records that become unusually emotional. A duchess in early August 1518 wrote that her pet cockatoo would no longer sing. It sits by the window, quiet as a nun. Has it taken on the sorrow of the city? She asked. Elsewhere, horses refused to ride into town, falcons failed to return from the sky, and dogs once obedient hid under beds or barked at shadows. For a ruling class that believed itself chosen by divine order, this defiance of animals seemed like an omen, a mutiny of the natural world. In the myths that followed, animals became part of the lore of the plague itself. A dog was said to have joined the dancers in the square, hopping and turning until it fell dead. A raven reportedly perched atop the cathedral for a full day, crying out each time a new dancer collapsed. Whether these stories are true matters less than that they were told, because they show how animals became part of the human psychic struggle. The nobility, for all their wealth and walls, could not shield themselves from the truth that animals were not merely decoration or diversion. They were witnesses, participants, sometimes even victims. A final look, animals between worlds, as the final dancers fell, collapsed from exhaustion, stroke, or heart failure. Strasbourg slowly began to still. The clergy declared that the madness had passed, whether through divine intervention, medical guidance, or sheer attrition. But for many nobles, the experience left a permanent mark, not only on how they viewed the common folk, but on how they viewed their animals. A quiet revolution had occurred. In noble estates that once prized order and display, there now existed a strange tension between control and care, between symbolic meaning and genuine affection. Diaries written in the months after the plague reflect an emotional shift. A baroness who once kept rabbits purely for fashion, fur, now allowed one to roam her solar chambers, calling it her guardian of dreams. A falconer who lost his brother to the plague took to releasing his birds one by one, saying they had earned their sky. Perhaps the most moving account comes from a noble boy, aged 10, whose pony had been stabled for safety throughout the dancing epidemic. When allowed to ride again, the child reportedly whispered to the animal, "You waited. You stayed still when I could not." In those few words, we glimpse something profound, the recognition that animals offered a kind of silent resilience, an unshaken presence when human control faltered. It's important to remember that not all animals returned to favor. Some, abandoned or suspected of carrying contagion, were never reclaimed. Ferrets, once kept by aristocratic children for play, were rounded up and drowned in several towns after being blamed for fluttering spirits. Exotic birds that died were often burned in ceremony, as if they had held within them some unspeakable power. But for those animals who survived horses, hounds, cats, birds, they became more than pets, more than tools. They were the only beings that had witnessed both the inner stillness of the manor and the chaos beyond its gates. They were living bridges. Reflection. The gilded cage in many ways. The noble class during the dancing plague lived in a gilded cage of their own making. They had wealth, power, and protection, but they also had a profound fear of what they couldn't control. And animals, no matter how well groomed or bred, ultimately belonged to a world that refused full submission. This is what made animals so fascinating to nobles. They were symbols of domination, and yet, at the same time, reminders of nature's will. A falcon could fly away, a horse could spook, a lapdog could choose to curl beside the sick servant instead of its mistress. And in those small rebellions, nobles glimpsed the terrifying truth that life was not a painting, nor a poem, nor a performance. It was unpredictable, wild, and at times deeply vulnerable. Even their efforts to project serenity through pet portraits, hunting parties, and elaborately trained beasts became thin veils over a society grappling with fear. While commoners brought their goats into bed or prayed over their chickens, nobles conducted rituals, commissioned treatments, and sent animals away when they could no longer be sure of their purity. The contrast is both heartbreaking and telling. Animals lived between two worlds, upstairs and downstairs, sacred and secular, feared and adored. They were not just characters in the story of the plague, they were reflections of the people who surrounded them. A final scene, the whisper in the stable. Let us close with a quiet scene knot, written in the official records, copied into marginalia, and shared by the candlelight of sleepy households long after the madness ended. It is said that in the waning days of July 1518, when Strasbourg was thick with heat and silence after the last dancers had fallen, a noblewoman of high esteem visited her stables for the first time in weeks. She had kept away out of fear, superstition, or perhaps simply heartbreak. Inside, the air was warm, dust dancing in shafts of golden light. Her favorite mare stood waiting. They had not touched in weeks. A stable boy had been tending her, keeping distance. But now the lady approached, her silk skirts brushing straw. She reached out, trembling, and pressed her palm to the horse's flank. The mare leaned into her. No words were spoken. But in that moment, the noblewoman wept not for the dancers in the street, not for the chaos, not even for herself, but because in the steady breath of her animal, she found something she hadn't felt in months: stillness, trust, life. In the years to come, this same noblewoman would fund animal care across several estates. She would commission physicians to study the calming presence of animals on human anxiety. And she would insist that every child of her household grow up with a companion creature, be it rabbit, bird, dog, or lamb. All because, in a time when all the world seemed to spin, her horse had stood still. Looking back, the contrast between peasant and noble in the context of animal life during the dancing plague is not merely about class. It is about how we perceive life itself, its power, and its comfort. For the poor, animals were family, healers, sacred vessels. For the rich, animals were symbols, currency, living trophies. And yet, in a time of crisis, those roles blurred. Dogs comforted mistresses. Cats were both feared and adored. Horses carried trembling lords to safety. Birds grew quiet when the dancers began to fall. Through their silence, animals became witnesses to the deepest fears and quietest hopes of a world that had forgotten how fragile it was. And centuries later, we still turn to them for comfort, for companionship, for calm in the chaos. Embers that never died. How the dance lingers in memory. The cobblestones are cool now. Centuries have passed. The dancers are long gone. Their bones have turned to dust beneath churchyards and fields, beneath houses rebuilt over old foundations. Strasbourg has grown, changed, modernized, and yet, in the stillest corners of Alsace, beneath the layers of modern pavement, beyond the bells of the cathedral, in old songs and whispered tales, the dancing never really stopped. It lingers, in memory, in fear, in festivals, in what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. It became a cultural echo, and echoes, as any weary soul knows, do not fade quickly. Memory wrapped in ritual. From disease to drama, one of the most enduring echoes of the dancing plague is found not in textbooks, but in theater. By the late 1600s, Alsatian towns had begun staging parish plays that dramatized the plague years. These were not always literal retellings. Rather, they were allegories, passion plays, where dancers symbolized pride, temptation, excess, or rebellion. In many towns, these plays were only permitted once every decade or generation. Locals whispered that performing them too often might summon the madness again. But for those who acted in them, young men playing devils or grieving mothers, musicians forced to play while dancers collapse, something powerful was transmitted. Not just story, but sensation. The terror of losing control. The fear of God. The defiance of death. Over time, these plays evolved. Some were banned. Others softened into folk dances, stripped of overt references to death, but still tinged with that old, unshakable rhythm. Even today, in parts of rural Alsace, there are processions on St. Vitus's Day where children dance in a slow, solemn circle, arms interlocked, eyes lowered. Most don't know why. We've always done it, an elder might say. It's for protection. It keeps the rest away. The rest, they don't need to say it. The rest is what took the dancers. The rest is the echo. From myth to memory, the psychology of Echo the Dancing Plague has never left the minds of historians, doctors, and folklorists. In fact, the story has grown more vivid with time, not less. Modern scholars debate its causative poisoning, mass hysteria, psychogenic illness, but almost all agree on one thing. Something deeply cultural kept it going. This wasn't a random outbreak. It had deep roots in expectation, fear, belief, and ritual memory. And those roots didn't disappear in 1518. Generations of Alsatians passed down stories of the dance not just as warning, but as cultural inheritance. Parents told children, "Don't tempt the saints, or if you mock the holy, you'll dance till you bleed." It became more than history. It became a boundary line, a moral fable, a cautionary tale, a shared understanding. That is the real echo. Because once a community experiences something so terrifying, so visible, and yet so unexplainable, it builds a defense. It ritualizes, it dramatizes, it encodes, and that encoding lasts centuries. Echoes in art, music, and silence. Even in modern Strasbourg, the ghost of the dance finds expression. Art installations in Strasbourg occasionally return to the theme. One installation at a university featured dozens of metronomes, all ticking slightly out of sync, building to a cacophony before falling silent. The name Trophia, a contemporary Alsatian folk band, released a haunting ballad titled 1518, where the lyrics, in an old dialect, describe feet that would not stop until the bells rang blood. In some churches, there are murals that may reference the plague. One shows a line of villagers dancing, all with the same face. Another depicts Saint Vitus with open arms, while dozens collapse at his feet. But the most haunting echo is this. There is no monument, no statue for the dancers, no plaque on the street, only stories, only memory, and perhaps in that silence we hear the echo best. Modern movements, how collective behavior mirrors the past. Though 5 centuries have passed since the cobbled streets of Strasbourg pulsed with frantic feet, the rhythms of that strange episode echo strangely in our modern world. The dancers of 1518 may be long gone, but their legacy lives on in how humans gather, move, and surrender themselves to collective rhythms, even today. While we may not call it a plague anymore, we still see the symptoms: ritual movement, loss of control, and a deep yearning for catharsis in places that might surprise us. Sometimes in clubs, sometimes on screens, sometimes in movements of grief or joy, sometimes in crisis, and always together. Let's explore how the spirit of the dance still lives, hidden in plain sight. The club as cathedral. Rave culture and trance to the uninitiated. A rave might seem like chaos, strobes flashing, bass lines pounding, bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, dripping with sweat and moving in unison for hours on end. But to those inside it, a rave is something else entirely, a ritual, one that uncannily mirrors the conditions of the 1518 plague. Participants often dance for hours without rest. Music plays continuously, creating an entrancing, hypnotic state. The crowd moves as a single body. Physical exhaustion is common. Emotional catharsis is expected. And in many cases, people report a loss of self, a kind of ecstatic trance. Raves aren't plagues, of course. They're voluntary, joyful, celebratory, but they show us something vital, the human desire to move until the pain stops, until something deeper is reached, until we are no longer alone. Psychologists studying trance states often draw comparisons between rave culture and pre-modern. Ritual dances, from whirling dervishes to shamanic ceremonies to, yes, the frenzied dancers of 1518. What separates a rave from a plague? Consent, context, or just the presence of a DJ instead of a curse? The line is thinner than we think. Social media as contagion, the viral dance phenomenon in our digitized world. A different kind of dance epidemic has taken root. Viral dance challenges. On platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, dances spread with astonishing speed. A catchy tune is paired with simple choreography, and within days, millions of people across the globe are repeating the same motions, recording themselves, and feeding the algorithm. This isn't madness, it's culture, but it shares some eerie similarities with historical outbreaks of collective movement, rapid spread through exposure, mimicry across diverse demographics, a sense of compulsion or urgency to participate, social reward, and emotional validation for conforming. In many ways, these viral dances are benign modern rituals, short bursts of shared experience that help us feel connected. But every so often, darker notes creep in. Reports of exhaustion, teens attempting dozens of takes late into the night, anxieties about not performing right, moments where it feels less like joy and more like pressure. Sound familiar? What we see in these digital trends is not a literal plague but a ritualized behavioral echo. The form is different, the function eerily familiar. Collective mourning, dancing through grief, another modern space where ritual movement echoes 1518. Grief. Around the world, communal dance is still used to process collective trauma and loss. After disasters, funerals, or tragedies, many cultures turn not to stillness but to rhythm. In Ghana, funerals often involve dancing pallbearers who honor the dead with joy. In New Orleans, jazz funerals march through the streets, with music leading the mourners from sorrow to celebration. In Palestine, DANCED dances are performed after funerals, not to forget, but to resist despair. These are not uncontrolled frenzies, but they are powerful, because they acknowledge something deeply human. Sometimes, when the world doesn't make sense, the only thing left to do is move. Just as Strasbourg's afflicted may have danced to express fear, grief, or spiritual desperation, so too do we today reach for ritual motion to hold what words cannot. Global mass psychogenic events. The echo repeats, believe it or not. Events like the 1518 dancing plague still happen today. They're now called mass psychogenic illnesses, and they follow a surprisingly consistent pattern. A small group experiences unexplained physical symptoms. These symptoms spread rapidly. No environmental cause can be found. The phenomenon eventually fades, often after some kind of ritual, acknowledgement, or shift in belief. Examples include the laughing epidemic in Tanganyika in 1962, where hundreds of students were overcome with uncontrollable laughter for weeks. The twitching outbreak in New York in 2011, where a cluster of high school girls developed tics resembling Tourette's, later linked to social contagion and stress. Workplace fainters in factories and call centers, especially in developing nations under stress. These cases are real. The suffering is real. And like the dancers of 1518, no physical disease is ever found. Instead, psychologists believe these are expressions of collective stress, bodily cries for help when no words will suffice. In each case, the outbreak eventually ends, not with medicine, but with ritual clarity, community meetings, media acknowledgement, religious blessings, or even simple time. The echo remains. It may not look like a woman dancing in the sun, but it is still us, still moving, still searching, still trying to make sense. Tradition as compass in modern times. We may not live by saints' days anymore, but we still seek rituals to mark time, navigate emotion, and feel belonging. In weddings, we dance. At protests, we march. At concerts, we sway. In yoga, we flow. In the streets, after a winner, a tragedy, we move. That's the legacy of the dance. Not the madness, not the plague, the human insistence on expressing what we feel through rhythm, motion, and the company of others. Science and spirit. How medicine grapples with ritual madness. The world of 1518 had no neurology departments, no psychology journals, no IG machines. There were no terms like conversion disorder, no classifications like somatoform, no MRIs or neurotransmitter maps to make sense of involuntary movement. When Frau Trophia began to dance, she was not seen as a patient. She was seen as a sign. Today, we look back through the lens of modern science and try to name what they saw. But here's the truth. Even now, in 2025, we're still struggling to fully understand what happened in Strasbourg, and more importantly, why echoes of it continue to emerge across the world. In this part, we'll explore how science approaches cases like the dancing plague, how neurologists, psychiatrists, anthropologists, and cultural theorists try to explain outbreaks of behavior that defy logic, and why sometimes they can't. Because even with all our tools, sometimes the line between ritual and illness is impossibly thin. From madness to mechanism, how we classify what we don't understand. In the decades following Freud, as psychiatry matured, new terms arose to describe strange outbreaks like 1518, mass hysteria, conversion disorder, mass psychogenic, illness, functional neurological symptom disorder. Each of these terms represents an attempt to label behaviors that look like physical disease but have no organic cause. In other words, the body is reacting, but there's no virus, no toxin, no injury. In 1518, they called it a curse. In 1900, they called it hysteria. In 2000, they called it psychogenic. Now, in some cases, we just call it idiopathic, a clinical way of saying we don't really know. One thing that modern clinicians agree on is this: these outbreaks are real. People suffer. Their bodies move without control. They sweat, cry, collapse. They're not faking it. They're expressing something deeper. Often, these cases emerge during collective stress times of war, oppression, isolation, fear, or spiritual unrest. Diagnosis as modern ritual. What do you do when someone walks into a hospital twitching uncontrollably, but tests completely normal? What do you do when 5 more follow, then 15? In 1518, they went to priests. Today, we go to clinics, but the core dynamic is eerily similar. We seek someone to observe and name our suffering. We want an answer that makes it real, but also treatable. We hope for some ritual, medical or otherwise, that can close the loop. The modern diagnostic process, pleasure, patient history, lab work is itself a kind of ritual. It reassures the patient. Someone is listening. Something is being done. When a doctor diagnoses MPI or FND, it often calms the panic. Not because it changes the symptoms immediately, but because naming the affliction gives it boundaries. Centuries ago, the ritual was a pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Vitus. Today, it might be a visit to a specialist, a round of physical therapy, or even a psychiatric consult. But the purpose is the same: to contain the chaos, to tell the sufferer, you are not alone, this is real, and there is a way forward. Why some cultures get plagues and others don't. Anthropologists have long noted that mass psychogenic illnesses don't happen equally everywhere. They tend to occur more often in highly collectivist societies, places where emotional expression is discouraged, communities under intense pressure, groups with limited access to mental health services. Sound familiar? 1518 Alsace was all of the above. As are many communities today where dancing-like outbreaks, tremors, fainting spells, or spirit possessions are still reported. What modern science has come to realize is that culture shapes the body. In places where people are not allowed to speak freely, the body may become the speaker. In places where emotional pain is taboo, motion becomes a substitute for voice. A famous case occurred in the 1990s in Kosovo, where groups of schoolgirls developed fainting spells and breathlessness. No cause was ever found. Another outbreak in rural Colombia saw dozens of teens struck with tremors and seizures again, with no clear cause. These outbreaks are now being studied with the same intensity as infectious diseases because their spread follows patterns. The vector isn't bacteria or fungus, it's belief, fear, expectation. And just like in 1518, the cure is not always physical. The brain-body bridge, neuroscience meets ritual. Modern neuroscience is beginning to explore how ritual movement can both cause and heal distress. In other words, the very thing that afflicted the dancers of Strasbourg may also be the thing that saves people like them today. In clinical settings, movement therapies like dance movement therapy, somatic experiencing, trauma-informed, yoga, rhythmic, auditory stimulation, are being used to help patients with PTSD, conversion disorders, and trauma-linked illnesses. Why? Because the body holds memory. Because, as many trauma therapists now say, what the body remembers, the mind cannot ignore. It's possible that the dancers of 1518 weren't mad. They were simply the first documented trauma patients to express it through motion. And the very idea that movement could be medicine has brought the story full circle. They danced because they could not speak. Now we dance to process what cannot be spoken. Who gets to decide? The politics of explanation. One of the most important modern lessons of 1518 is this: the way a society explains strange behavior reveals everything about what it fears and what it values. In 1518, the explanation was spiritual, a curse, a saint, a punishment. In 1850, it was feminine, hysteria, blamed on wandering wombs. In 1950, it was Freudian, repressed trauma, expressing itself physically. In 2000, it was neurological, a misfiring brain under stress. Each of these explanations tells us less about the dancers and more about the culture that judged them. Even now, the tension remains. Should someone with psychogenic tremors be referred to a psychiatrist, a neurologist, a priest, who decides whether this is a medical issue or a spiritual one? Who has the authority to interpret the movement? Who speaks for the dancer? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, if it happened again tomorrow, would we know how to respond? Feet, remember. Art, memory. And the legacy of 1518 in modern culture. As the centuries passed, the sound of frantic feet fading into legend. The world did not forget the dancing plague of 1518, but we remembered it differently. We painted it. We wrote it into fiction. We wove it into metaphors. We staged it as ballet. We danced it again not in fear, but in remembrance. In this part, we explore how artists, performers, writers, and everyday people have kept the spirit of 1518 alive through story, spectacle, and collective memory. The plague that once terrified Europe has become a canvas, a place where we paint our fears, our fascinations, and our truths about being human. Because even when facts fade, stories dance on, painting the madness, visual art, and the grotesque even in the 16th century. Artists were captivated by the dancing plague. Prints, woodcuts, and manuscripts began to depict wild scenes of people leaping, arms flailing, faces twisted in agony or ecstasy. These early depictions were often grotesque, anxious images caught between horror and humor. Artists like Hans Holbein and Peter Bruegel would become famous for portraying human folly, vice, and disease in theatrical detail. Later interpretations, especially in the Romantic era, portrayed the event with a surreal, dreamlike quality. Painters imagined dancers floating, levitating, or caught in strange liminal states, not quite alive, not quite dead. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the aesthetic shifted again. Artists began to see the dancing plague as metaphor for oppression, for lost agency, for the chaos beneath civilization, for the beautiful, terrible unpredictability of the human body. Installations, murals, and digital works have emerged around the theme. Dancers depicted with smeared limbs, spiraled bodies, translucent feet, as if time itself blurred the outlines. To paint the plague was to ask a question: what happens when our bodies rebel? Who owns the rhythm inside us? Literary echoes, novels, poems, and the dance of words. Writers have long been drawn to the strange magnetism of the 1518 outbreak. It appears in genres ranging from historical fiction to gothic horror to philosophical allegory. A few notable examples: Jean novel Entrées dans la Danse fictionalizes the events with visceral, nightmarish detail. In Ollie Smith's Summer, a character references 1518 as a metaphor for collective helplessness. The poet Joy Harjo has written of dance as a form of survival, echoing the same rhythms seen in Strasbourg. Even speculative fiction like Black Mirror and the OA feature dance-like trances that nod toward unseen forces pulling us into motion. Again and again, the plague is used to talk about something more: mob mentality, spiritual unrest, the weight of grief, or the uncontrollable nature of being alive in a fragile, reactive body. It's not just about history. It's about humanity, or longing to be understood, even when language fails. Reenactments and rituals, festivals of memory across Europe, including parts of modern-day France and Germany. Festivals sometimes recall the strangeness of 1518. While not always labeled as commemorations, these events echo it in form. Outdoor processions, mass dancing, ritual music, communal meals, symbolic movements of grief, resistance, or renewal. In Strasbourg, a few local performances and walking tours now mention the event, though no formal annual ceremony exists. Still, the idea of the plague lives on as a ghost within the city's historical tours, underground theater, and art collectives. In 2018, on the 500th anniversary, several European dance troupes staged interpretive performances across major cities, reenacting the plague through modern dance, spoken word, and immersive theater. These events weren't about mocking the dancers of old. They were rituals of empathy, a way to step into the worn-out shoes of the afflicted, and remember that suffering can take any form, even movement. From ballet to experimental stage, choreographing history. Perhaps most striking is how choreographers have taken the story and turned it into living, moving art. The body, after all, was the original text of the dancing plague. So it makes sense that modern dancers would reclaim it, this time with intention, with grace, with agency. Choreographers like Pina Boucher who explored themes of trauma and physical surrender. Marie Chouinard, known for grotesque, ritualistic motion. Hafesh Schechter, whose aggressive, pulsing group dances mirror contagious movement, have all created works not directly about 1518, but unmistakably inspired by its essence. The most direct homage was Dancing Plague of 1518, a multi-act ballet premiered in the UK, using archival texts, medieval music, and visceral choreography to tell the story of Strasbourg's mysterious week of madness. The dancers stagger, leap, collapse. The music shifts between choral serenity and frantic drums. The audience is left breathless, not because they fully understand what happened, but because they feel it in their bones. And that's the point. Art doesn't need to explain the plague. It just needs to honor it. Music and memory. The sound of the plague in 1518. Music was part of the Quran, perhaps part of the cause. Today, composers and musicians have turned back to that idea, imagining what the plague might have sounded like. Avant-garde composer Dan Deacon created an orchestral electronic piece titled Dancing Madness, layering choral Latin, medieval percussion, and chaotic digital noise. Sound artists have sampled heartbeats, footsteps, and breathing to recreate the sense of being trapped inside motion. Experimental bands like Swans, Godspeed You!, Black Emperor, and Dead Can Dance have all touched on similar themes of ritual. There are playlists titled Dance Until You Drop, used in art installations. Podcasts exploring sound therapy have referenced the idea of using music to induce trance. Even ambient sleep music occasionally borrows from medieval motifs: chant, lute, frame, drum, creating haunting loops that make the modern listener feel just a little closer to Strasbourg. And perhaps that's the final beauty of it. Even 5 centuries later, we can still hear the echo, the act of remembering a modern ritual. Every time we say the dancing plague, we repeat a kind of spell. We summon a moment in history when humans broke from order, when grief and pain moved through bodies, when the rules of reality seemed to bend. To remember 1518 is to remember that suffering is not always still, that healing is not always quiet, that sometimes, to survive, we must move together, even without knowing why. And so artists, dancers, writers, musicians, and dreamers continue the work not of solving the mystery, but of keeping it alive. The past does not need to explain itself. It only needs to be honored. Movement and belief. The story of the dancing plague of 1518 might seem distant, locked behind layers of ancient dust, worn manuscripts, and strange woodcuts, but in ways subtle and overt, its legacy pulses through modern life, especially in the way we think about movement, healing, and the strange intersection of spirituality and the body. We don't call it a plague anymore. We call it embodiment, somatic release, dance therapy, ecstatic movement, or flow state, but the echo is unmistakable. This part explores how wellness culture, spiritual practice, and even internet subcultures have recreated, intentionally or not, the same spaces the dancing plague once occupied. Spaces where the body becomes the message, where movement becomes medicine, where letting go means salvation. It refers to therapies that explore the mind-body connection through physical movement. Practices like trauma release exercises, body mapping, contact improvisation, all revolve around the idea that our emotions are stored in our muscles, that trauma lives in the nervous system, and that sometimes you must move to heal. when pressure built with no release valve. Modern somatic therapists talk about spontaneous shaking, involuntary swaying, emotional tremors during movement, not as pathology, but as healing in motion. Some practitioners even suggest that what happened in Strasbourg was not madness, but an unstructured somatic release triggered by collective trauma. Remembered something ancient, that when pain becomes too much to carry, you must move it out. Ecstatic dance and trance states in yoga studios, festival fields, and urban wellness spaces across the US and Europe. The trend of ecstatic dance has grown rapidly in the 21st century. The rules are simple: no talking, no alcohol or drugs, no choreography. Some say it's spiritual, others call it therapeutic, some just find it fun. But whether it's held in a Brooklyn loft, a San Francisco warehouse, or under the desert sky at Burning Man, the effect is strangely familiar. A room full of strangers, dancing into exhaustion, surrendering to rhythm. Does it sound like 1518? A sense of having purged something ancient, something unspoken. The facilitators speak of moving stuck energy, unlocking trauma, and restoring nervous system balance. Even the music echoes the past. Tribal drums, medieval chant, layered rhythms that build into a trance. In this sense, 1518 lives on not as a warning, but as a blueprint. The same body, the same urge. Belief systems centered on the idea of embodied divinity. From Kundalini awakenings to shamanic shaking, from tantric breathwork to ritualistic movement meditations, the idea persists that the body is not separate from the spirit. That spiritual awakening sometimes looks like madness. Convulsions, ecstatic moaning are now embraced by seekers around the world as signs of energetic breakthrough. Some ceremonies even feature the intentional inducement of trance states, by breath, by drum, by chant, by repetition, and in these trances, people report feelings similar to those recorded in 1518. Loss of time, surreal visions, cathartic weeping, physical exhaustion, followed by lightness. These are no longer feared. They're marketed, packaged into retreats, workshops, and spiritual coaching. The very thing that once sent clerics scrambling for exorcisms is now called inner work. Are we more evolved now? Or have we simply rebranded the same ancient knowledge? The internet, virality, and digital trances, it may seem a leap to compare medieval dancers to TikTok users. But in terms of collective movement and viral contagion, the comparison holds. What is a viral dance trend, if not a kind of modern contagion? Think of the way choreography spreads on platforms like TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube. One person posts a short dance. Within hours, thousands imitate it. Within days, millions move in sync. No one gets sick, but something transfers a rhythm, a movement, a shared impulse to copy. It feels involuntary, urgent, fueled by the crowd. In fact, some theorists have called modern virality a form of digital possessionware. Ideas inhabit people across space and time, prompting similar behaviors. In 1518, that contagion was dancing. In 2024, it might be a dance trend, a meme, or a ritual. But either way, we move together, even when we don't fully know why. Of grief, response, and embodied protest against suffering no one could name aloud. And in today's world, when tragedy strikes a school shooting, a wildfire, a war, the response often comes through ritual movement. We've seen mass die-ins where people lie still, forming the shape of a body, silent marches where thousands step in unison, holding candles. Choreographed performances in public squares meant to symbolize pain, loss, and hope. These aren't always labeled as healing, but they are. They represent our attempt to do what words can't. Honor suffering in motion. Grief still needs a rhythm. Pain still demands a body. Even in funerals, we often see mourners swaying, rocking, or holding each other with a subtle choreography that feels ancient. We may not break into full trance dance, but our movements are still a language of survival. Is this the cure we needed? Looking at all of this, from ecstatic dance to TikTok trends, from trauma release to spiritual shaking, you might wonder, have we finally found a cure? Not for the plague, but for the kind of suffering that caused it. In 1518, people danced because they didn't have a therapist. We've remembered how to listen to it. So we move with drums, with breath, with intention. We don't fear the rhythm anymore. We choose it, and in choosing it, perhaps we've redeemed the past. To dance again, preserving memory and meaning beyond the plague. The dancing plague of 1518 was never fully explained. No single diagnosis solved the riddle. No one cured it in the way modern science might demand, but perhaps that's the point. What happened in Strasbourg was not just a moment in medical history, nor merely a cultural oddity. And now, in this final part of the story, we ask, how should we carry this memory forward? What does it mean to honor something so strange, so unsettling, and so deeply human? The answer, it seems, lies not only in studying the past, but in repeating it, reverently and intentionally. Through ritual, art, tradition, and reflection, we keep the dancers alive, not as curiosities, but as guides. Let's step into the present and future with them. The return of rituals. Rituals are the skeleton keys of memory. They are the ways we encode the past into the body, repeating motions that recall and transform. And yes, people do still ritualize the dancing plague. Every summer in Strasbourg, quiet academic events are sometimes held to discuss the outbreak. But more impactful are the public performances and reenactments that breathe life back into those ghostly movements. Some examples include interpretive dance troupes performing plague-inspired pieces at European arts festivals, modern choreographers creating dances that incorporate trembling, spirals, and collapse, community healing events that draw on historical movement patterns for release. These aren't reenactments for spectacle. They're modern efforts to say, we remember, we understand, we are still here, still moving, still healing. In this way, the dancing plague becomes a living memory, a tradition not of fear, but of awakening. Art, literature, and cultural memory artists across mediums have begun to weave the strange tale of 1518 into visual, literary, and digital arts. In paintings and sculpture, contemporary European artists have depicted skeletal dancers in modern clothes, suggesting how the plague still follows us. Mixed media installations allow museum visitors to walk through soundscapes of drums, chants, and whispered prayers, replicating the atmosphere of Strasbourg in 1518 in literature and poetry. Novelists have reimagined the plague through feminist, psychological, and spiritual lenses. Poets reflect on the blurred line between liberation and torment, between holy dance and helpless collapse in digital art and gaming. Indie games reference the plague, framing it as a metaphor for lost control. Graphic novels, draw inspiration from the haunting visuals of 16th century engravings of twisted dancers. These reinterpretations preserve the story. But more importantly, they recontextualize it, making it relevant, compelling, and emotionally accessible for new generations. Education, teaching through mystery. Strasbourg 1518 has quietly entered modern classrooms, but not always as just a bizarre footnote. Some educators use the plague to explore mass hysteria and the psychology of group behavior, cultural expressions of grief in pre-modern Europe, the history of medicine, dance, or mysticism, the politics of suppression and spiritual censorship. Students are often more engaged with this topic than expected. Why? Because it feels familiar. Because even now, we feel the stirrings of strange behavior, unexplained suffering, and longing for expression. In American classrooms, the dancing plague is increasingly presented not as a medical curiosity, but as a case study in humanity. It challenges students to ask, what does it mean to be overwhelmed by emotion? How do cultures respond to suffering they can't name? When does healing look like madness? What does society do with people who won't stop moving? These are questions as relevant today as they were in 1518. Tradition in the digital age. Traditions don't always require incense and parchment. In the digital age, they take new forms. Online forums, TikTok discussions, YouTube documentaries, and even fan-made tributes are how modern generations participate in the remembering. In some ways, digital communities have created new rituals for engaging with obscure histories like this, sharing haunting music inspired by medieval rhythms, creating dance challenges based on the theme of losing control, designing clothing or art that features historical iconography like plague dancers and religious banners. These aren't just aesthetic choices. They're acts of cultural continuity, a way of saying, this story is part of our story, too. And when people comment under a video or post, writing, this reminds me of my own panic attacks. I danced like this once when I couldn't stop crying. I think this was about grief, not madness. ... They are participating in the collective memory. We are building a new tradition, one that spans continents, one that lives online, one that honors pain and movement as sacred. Reframing the language. One of the most powerful ways to preserve a tradition is to change how we speak about it. In recent years, there has been a push to reframe the dancing plague, not as mass hysteria or madness, but as collective trauma response, embodied protest, somatic spiritual eruption. This isn't historical revisionism, it's historical compassion. By examining how past scholars used dismissive or fear-based language, we become aware of how our own culture treats the vulnerable, and we take a step forward. If 1518 was a warning, then let us heed it by changing how we name suffering. Let us no longer mock, but understand. Let us no longer exile, but embrace. Let us see in every trembling dancer not a warning of madness, but a mirror of the human soul in pain. Closing the circle. Why the dance matters. We began this journey in a hot summer in Strasbourg, where one woman began to dance, and others could not stop. We traveled through mystery, myth, despair, control, resistance, animals, contrast, and recovery. And now, as we close this circle, let us ask again, what does the dancing plague of 1518 teach us? It teaches that the body remembers. It teaches that society fears what it cannot explain. It teaches that movement is a language, and it may be the first language we ever knew, but above all, It teaches that even in darkness we move, sometimes involuntarily, sometimes in defiance, sometimes to survive, sometimes in joy. And when we remember those who moved before us, when we honor the steps they could not stop taking, when we build rituals to hold their stories, we don't just preserve a tradition, we become it. Thank you for walking through this story with me. If you found it meaningful, calming, or thought-provoking, please follow my channel, History for the Tired, for more soothing journeys into the strange and beautiful past. The world is full of forgotten footsteps. Let's listen for them together.